live.
Hi,
Eight.
hello?
Oh,
Can you hear me? Okay, we're on. Hi, welcome to the special meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission, Tuesday, October 13th, 2015, 7:30 p.m., Brisbane City Hall, 50 Park Place, Brisbane. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Anderson,
present.
Commissioner Doe,
Present.
Commissioner Minier,
Here.
Commissioner Parker,
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt.
Here.
Can we have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
I have a motion to adopt the agenda.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, on to new business. Today is public hearing for the Brisbane Baylands Final Environmental Impact Report and related planning applications. Baylands Concept Plans, Brisbane Baylands Specific Plan, General Plan Amendment Case GP-01-06. Specific topics include traffic and circulation and noise. Universal Paragon Corporation is the applicant. Owners, various. APN, various.
Well, Madam Chair, I know you had some introductory remarks in terms of the meeting format or structure. I don't know if you were intending on.
Can we follow that up right before we open public hearing?
Oh, if you want to, sure,
Yes.
that'd be great. I'm waiting for Mr. Zola. He seems to have stepped out momentarily.
Well, in that case, maybe we can move on with that so we don't.
Sure.
So we can expedite things and be efficient. So hopefully everyone has picked up a sheet. Up front is the Planning Commission guidelines for Baylands public hearings, something we agreed to prior to, during the workshops and prior to our first public hearing. But just a few reminders. We are going to have the staff report first, then we have commission questions that are relegated to and specific to informational questions, just specifically for the topics on hand, which would be, again, traffic and circulation and noise. And then we open it up to the public hearing. Note that the adopted PC rules call for meetings to end at 10:30 unless extended. The goal is to allow the public to fully participate in the hearings and to have their say in a manner that is respectful of everyone's time and the scope at task. So with the scope at task portion, we really, really would appreciate that speakers stay on topic and be conscious of their time so that everyone has a chance to speak. Meetings can be extended. Meetings can also be continued to another night if there is a need. So in terms of the public hearing organization, could I have a show of hands of people interested in speaking? 2? Okay. And in terms of the time that we had set earlier as a general framework, 1 minute, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and anything above 5 minutes. So a show of hands for a minute? No? 3 minutes? 3 minutes. 3. Anyone around 5 minute mark? Yeah, I think that's it, right? But I'm just anticipating, well, I guess we'll get to the rebuttals later. Okay, so we can have individual speakers have their time extended. All speakers are requested to fill out speaker cards. We have it right at the back. And we'll try to organize the speakers according to the shorter comments going first. Also, as a courtesy to your fellow citizens, please adhere to the time limits established by the Planning Commission and agreed to by the community. Address the questions and comments to the Commission. Please keep comments to the topics under consideration. And if anybody has made a comment that you are agreeing to, please state that you support that comment and there's no need to repeat it. And the purpose of the hearing is to allow everyone to make their comments, so it's not a debate. Please refrain from responding to or critiquing other public comments, as they also have a right to speak, as you do. Thank you.
With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Zola.
Getting better on remembering to bring this up with me. So tonight we'll be talking about traffic and transit and then also noise. As we talk about traffic tonight, we have also over next to where I was just sitting, Andy Kaczynski with Farron Piers, who will talk a little bit about the methodology that was used in analyzing the traffic that we'll be talking about tonight. what I wanted to start with is in the analysis regarding traffic, there were 18 intersections studied as shown on this map in and around the Baylands. And what was analyzed were intersections in Brisbane, San Francisco, Daly City, and then at the southern side of the project, what was not analyzed are some of the internal intersections within the Baylands. The analysis focuses on the impacts of the Baylands on the outside world and the streets that you have right now, as well as analysis of the Geneva extension and the freeway interchanges that are being proposed. Now, in the analysis, there are certain assumptions being made regarding what improvements will be made. And so key among these are the extension of Geneva Avenue is part of the development program, not for the Baylands, but part of the bi-county study. And so one of the mitigation measures laid out in the traffic study, in the traffic analysis section 4N, ties the development of the Baylands to fair share and actual operation of the Geneva extension, as well as the redesign of the Candlestick interchange, because there's just way too much development being proposed within the Baylands as well as to the north in San Francisco to allow to be developed without those major improvements. There are also assumptions based on transit improvements. These transit improvements that are cited in the EIR are all now proposed improvements. So these include the extension of the T third line from Sunnydale down to the Caltrain Bayshore Station. Bus rapid transit, you'll hear this expression as we go on, BRT, that would extend along Geneva Avenue. The San Francisco transit folks are now contemplating what they will do with bus rapid transit before the Geneva extension, and they do not have a plan on where that will run, and the folks in Little Hollywood have had a lot to say about that. But in the improvements related to the project are the assumption that bus rapid transit will be available along Geneva, and then implementation of the Bayshore Intermodal Station study. And that involves reconfiguring the Bayshore Caltrain station to accommodate bus rapid transit, as well as there's two options that San Francisco had proposed to move that station south, one I believe 300 feet, a couple hundred feet either way. But all of the options that San Francisco had identified to move forward with study in actual design in their intermodal study had the Bayshore station moving south. And you will see in San Francisco's comments on the draft EIR, they then say, oh, no, the station ought to move north. But the EIR that is used for the analysis of the Baylands is based on the study done by San Francisco and the options they laid out in relation to the location of the Bayshore Intermodal Station. Let's see, we'll go this way. What I'd like is Andy Kaczynski from Fair and Peers will talk a little bit about the methodology that was used to analyze. We had comments on the draft EIR as to why is the San Francisco model being used to analyze traffic, how is transit analyzed in the EIR, as well as the issue of internal capture, and Andy will talk about those three topics.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Andy Kaczynski. I'm a registered civil engineer, and I've been working on the project as a consultant with Fair and Peers Transportation Consultants. I'll be stepping through these three different elements of the methodology. Firstly, the use of the SF-CHAMP model, and SF-CHAMP is the name of a travel demand model that is operated by San Francisco County Transportation Authority, and it's used to estimate future year traffic volumes and transit volumes and other travel in the future years. So this model was selected to estimate the year 2030 volumes for this study area. The SF Champ model covers the entire 9-county Bay Area, and it also represents the city of San Francisco and its immediate environment in a higher level of detail, an extremely high level of detail. So one of the big benefits of this particular model is the level of detail that it does have for the Brisbane Baylands area and surroundings, especially to the north. And because of this, this SF Champ model is best able to represent future transit improvements such as the Geneva bus route, which is an SFMTA project primarily. Another reason for the selection of the SF Champ model is because of the level of detail in the surrounding area to Brisbane Baylands. It represents approved and proposed development projects in the study area at a high level of detail, and one of the key drivers, one of the key issues for future volumes is what the effect of nearby development projects that will be constructed between now and 2030 will have on traffic in the area. So CHAMP is the model that best captures this. So for the aforementioned reasons, it was selected for use for this analysis. Secondly, I want to move on to talk about the transit mode share for the project. And we were fortunate that there are a number of different sources of data on mode split of travel in the Bay Area that we could lean on to estimate how many people would use each different mode within the Baylands project, not just transit, but automobile, walk, bike, and taxi, and so on. The three main data sources that we used which informed the mode share were Census 2010, which is the census conducted every 10 years and collects information on how people travel to work and the modes they use. But we also employed the American Community Survey data, which is an ongoing statistical survey carried out by the Census Bureau, and that collects information on household characteristics such as transportation to work. And the third data source is a study called Travel Characteristics of Transit-Oriented Developments in California. It is a research paper which contains a lot of detailed information on travel behavior for transit-oriented developments in the state of California. Of particular interest, it collects data around three existing Caltrain stations, which is Broadway, Mountain View, Palo Alto, which is extremely relevant data to use for this project, which is adjacent to the Bayshore Caltrain station. So by having these three different data sources, and we were able to determine that the transit mode share was quite similar between the three data sources, we ended up using essentially an average for the mode share and applied it to the work trips and the non-work trips of the project. It turned out that for work trips, transit mode share was around 15%, and for non-work, it was around 10%. So having three different data sources allowed us a high level of confidence in the mode splits that we used.
I'm sorry, can you explain that a little further? Are you saying that are all of Bay, just in this area or throughout the whole Bay Area?
Yeah. So using the census and the American Community Survey data, we were able to zero in on the immediate Baylands area and the immediate surroundings to extract specific mode split data for what is currently used by residents and employees in the Baylands area. So it is location specific to the project site. And the third study is a bit more general, but it really captures the effects of a transit-oriented development in particular. So we're able to look at peer areas that are similar in composition, land use type, so on, to the Baylands area. And so we use those three different sources. So moving on to talk a little bit about the concept of internal capture. So for trip generation purposes, the first step is we use a source called the ITE Trip Generation Manual. So ITE is the Institution of Transportation Engineers. This is a long-established methodology that uses nationwide data to inform a typical trip generation rate for a particular land use. However, one of the drawbacks of that approach is that it essentially assesses a particular land use in a vacuum, assuming in isolation. And the Baylands project is a mixed-use project where many different land uses are constructed adjacent to each other, and so that would lead to more of the trips that the land use creates being local and internal to the site, such as people who live above a grocery store. They would walk to that grocery store rather than getting in their car and maybe driving a mile or two to the nearest grocery store.
Could you explain what 5% means?
5% capture?
Yes.
Yes. So what that would mean is, on the slide here, I'm saying that for home-based work trips, 5% of the trips are captured. And so let's say the project generates 100 trips. 5 of those would stay internal to the Baylands site. So 95 would leave the Baylands site. The 5 that stay within the Baylands site, we assume would almost certainly be bicycle or walk trips. Therefore, we deduct that amount from the automobile and transit.
But what are you deducting it from? Because people are going to make trips of different lengths and different to different locations. So, the 5% is rather nebulous. I mean, in the study itself, there's pages and pages of numbers, but I was hoping you might break that down a little bit for us.
Absolutely. So, the initial assumption taken from ITE is that all the trips, let's say there's a housing building on the project site, all of the trips are external to Baylands, so none of them would start in the housing unit and end within the Baylands development. They would all go further afield. And what research has shown, and I could go into some more details on the research, which is the underpinning to the trip capture, is that when you have a mixed-use development, especially on the scale of Baylands, with you have retail, potentially office, potentially residential, very close to each other, a lot of those trips would never leave the Baylands. And so the assumption is that the overall trips generated by all these land uses is the same, but in this case, 5% of those trips simply stay within the Baylands development and therefore do not leave. And examples of that are people that would live within Baylands, work also within Baylands, and therefore it's very likely they would just simply walk to work and not get in their car and drive to work in a far away place.
Yes, well, I'm sorry for being a bit pedantic, but you only restated what you told me the first time. I'm trying to get more of an idea about how the study worked in terms of analyzing where people are going to go with or without housing on the Baylands. For example, how many new housing units are being built immediately around the Baylands? How many housing units already exist around the Baylands? How do you figure out what the dispersion of people interested in going to the Baylands? No matter how wonderful it is, you're probably not going to have too many people driving up from Los Angeles, and you probably will have a number of people coming from the surrounding areas. So, on your slide here, you have numbers like 5% and 16%, but it's really unclear what the numerator and denominators are and what the distances of those trips are and how you manage to come up with the, quite frankly, enormous CO2 savings compared to the CPP. And I've never understood that, despite attempting, but maybe I'm just not very good at math, and I was hoping that maybe in this presentation you could help break that down, because there's a lot of numbers to try and get through in that appendix.
Absolutely. So I will be happy to try my best to answer your question as thoroughly as I can. The underpinning research into the internal capture is it's a methodology that was developed in association with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It has been endorsed by Caltrans for use in project-specific and planning-level analyses, and essentially it takes into account a lot of different sites were surveyed around the country of mixed-use developments, such as what Baylands is, well over a few dozen, and what the data collected was essentially to determine, compared to building all of these different uses separately, when you build them immediately adjacent to each other as part of the same development, it simply was a survey to quantify, assuming the overall number of trips was the same, and that is what was found, how many stay within the site. I see that Lloyd is there.
I think you're asking
It's
maybe
too confusing. Very confusing.
we got two different questions. So let's start with the SF Champ model and how that identifies where trips are heading. So with an origin in the Baylands or an ending in the Baylands to where they're going. And I think the other question you're asking is, with all the development being proposed immediately adjacent, 10,000 residential units and more. So let me answer the demographic question, then Andy can handle how the SF Champ model works. So I think that's where we'll start there, then get down to the simple answer is the 5% means in the DSP and scenario of those 4,400 units, of all those people going to work, 5% of those 4,400 dwelling units will work in the Baylands. Now the question is, where are they going to work? And when we look at the demographics, first of all, of what's going on to the north, 10,000 dwelling units, but along with those 10,000 dwelling units at Hunters Point, Candlestick Point, Executive, and all of those projects, Schlage Lock, there's also a few million square feet of non-residential use. So it's not 10,000 dwelling units with no employment added would have a different effect than what is actually occurring there. The other part of the demographic is an issue within San Francisco and the Bay Area as a whole. And that is, right now, the Bay Area has more jobs than it has people working in those jobs. And the Bay Area is a net importer of labor. And anybody who lives out in Pleasanton, you just see that coming over the Altamont Pass, down in San Jose, everybody coming up from Gilroy and wherever. Even after you add all that development occurring to the north, you also have to look at what's going on with all the construction in San Francisco. Those big towers going up, and San Francisco is building room for more employment than it's building housing. And that's been a big issue for San Francisco. ABAG as a whole recognizes there are more jobs in the Bay Area than there are employed workers. And even so, the projections in the recently adopted Plan Bay Area says that trend of building more employment than housing is going to continue. And so what you have is even with 4,400 units at the Baylands, there still is employment and 10,000 dwelling units, so that trend of employment and trips being farther away. The concept, and we'll talk about it again next week in relation specifically to air quality and GHG, is the trip distance. And the simple formulation is the closer people are to jobs, not the closer they're going to work, but the shorter the average trip is going to be. And so it's just a basic relationship. Put housing near jobs, trip distances are different. And you see that in a comparison, let's say, of what goes on in Tracy right now, lots of workers, very little jobs, and they take long drives into Livermore, Pleasanton. In San Francisco, the people who live there, much closer to jobs, tend to be shorter trips. And so you get that working, that's the demographics. So I'll let Andy talk about how the model accounts for all of that, unless you have a...
And I have one more specific question then. So is what you just said there, that in the 5% capture, to just look at only the first scenario,
Yeah.
in the 5% capture scenario then, you're saying, 5% of those people are going very short, the other 95% are all making average trips in aggregate.
Yeah.
And you're comparing that with 100% of the people making average trips in aggregate. Is that what you said?
The home-to-work trips. Right.
Right. Just looking at the first scenario of home-to-work trips.
Right. So comparing the home-to-work trips, what this would say is 5% of the home-to-work trips will stay within the Baylands, will not leave.
Right.
And in the DSP scenario, so that's the relationship between the 4,400 dwelling units and the couple million square feet. And then in the CPP scenarios, home-to-work all leaves because there's no home.
Right. So the question, my specific question is the all leave scenario. You're just assuming that in the aggregate, 100% of those people are making average trips. Some of them short, it's just some of them long.
Yeah.
Is that how the math works out?
And Andy can talk about the model, but the general way models work, I'll give my layman's view and then you can do the technical view. And that is, what the model will do is essentially balance out the number of trips in the model. So it will say a home-to-work trip goes from a home, it's got to land somewhere in employment.
Right.
And the other way around. And so the model then lays out where is the housing, and I can't remember, you can talk about which one is generation. And,
Right.
But the model will balance that out. So there'll be trips of different distances based on where is employment and how does that balance. So why don't you talk about how the model balances out productions and attractions is the concept
I'm sorry, I just have one question. So this scenario you're presenting right now is if we put in 4,400 housing.
Yeah, in the DSP scenario.
The DSP scenario.
Right. And that's the reason you see under each of these types of trips, or at least the first two that have a home involved, the DSP scenario is very different than the CPP scenarios because there is no residential in the CPP scenarios. When you talk about non-home-based trips from something that's not a home to someplace that's not a home, what we all do, work, drive to lunch, that kind of thing, that's within the Baylands.
Okay.
I mean, the 5% part is really clear.
Okay.
That part's very clear. But what's less clear is really how the model treats the 95% and how the model treats the 100%. Because people have preferences. Maybe everyone would like to live south of Market and work in a high-paying job so they could afford to do that. But not everyone has the skills to do that. And in the Baylands project, there's going to be different kinds of jobs. There may be the kinds of jobs that are only taken by people who can only afford to live in Tracy, even if you do provide housing. So I was wondering, those 5% people who are going to live in the Baylands, that's a small enough number that did the model account for the fact that some of those would be displaced to the surrounding units, or do you just assume that those surrounding units are filled up with other people?
And Andy can talk about how the model assigns where trips go from one traffic zone to another. So if there's a traffic zone in the Baylands that encompasses housing in the DSP scenario, how the model accounts for where that goes. And that will also deal with some of the distances involved of where they go. But that's the balancing between what are called productions and attractions. So if you have other questions, go ahead. That's all right.
One more question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the model accounts for the kind of housing that's proposed for the Baylands, low cost versus high cost, and the kinds of jobs that are anticipated in the Baylands.
Yeah, I think that's much more fine than the model gets to.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy can talk about breakdown of residential. I think there may be differences between single family, multifamily, and different types of commercial, but it's not trying to match that exactly. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, at this point in this planning process, you cannot determine what is the income of the residents to what are the salaries of the employees. And so
Right.
this is all an averaging based on actual travel patterns that are seen in the Baylands.
Okay,
Does that make sense? Okay.
That makes
for
sense.
now.
My initial response, Commissioner Anderson, you bring up the 5% and the 95% and the 0% and 100%. The 95% and 100% do both have the same distribution of trips throughout the region to jobs throughout the region, to answer that specific point. So it's the 5% that are internally captured. It's not that they're in some way taken just from what would have been nearby trips or just from very far trips. They're taken from all points of trip length that they would have been.
Okay.
Yeah, if then you could talk about just how the SF Champ model lays out where these trips would go, and so some of the inputs that the model gives you that end up being used as trip length and vehicle miles traveled.
Yeah, so ultimately the SF Champ model, in terms of trip attractions and trip reductions, it knows how many people there are in each zone, it knows how many jobs there are in each zone, and it, based on a very complicated and complex series of variables as to who typically works where, assigns people to job centers, and that's validated against survey data, so that we know that the SF Champ model, to a very high degree of accuracy, accurately represents what is currently on the ground. If you take a zone next to the Baylands project, the SF Champ model will tell you where all those people are going to work throughout the region and throughout San Francisco, and that's gives us, and when you take the SF Champ model as a whole, it allows us to determine for people living in a particular zone where throughout the region their job trips, their retail trips are going to be distributed, and so we can use that information and apply it to what we estimate are going to be the trips generated by the Baylands project. So that's...
Okay, so when you say that the model's validated by survey data, does that mean that you take your prediction data and then when the present catches up with the future, you compare and calculate the standard deviations from your prediction versus the actual?
Actually, I think what occurs is that for a particular, when an SF Champ model is run, they take, it's not so much you build a new project, estimate it, and then find out in the future what's happened. It's when you look at a current zone currently, and through census and other data sources, we know where those people are traveling. We run the model, and we essentially compare what the model is saying to the current data, and if there are some areas where it's not quite right, then different variables are explored and changed such that...
So then you mean it's estimated from the survey data, it's not validated by the survey data?
I think that essentially the predicted travel volumes and patterns match observed travel volumes and patterns within a specified tolerance for that year. So that's what I mean when I say validated.
Well, you're talking about a project that hasn't been built yet.
Yeah.
Typically, that's what this is used for, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can't validate an estimate. We're getting too pedantic, so let's move on.
No.
That's important.
I just want to make sure we're all using the same, because I've worked with traffic guys, and there's a certain language they use. The model is calibrated over time, so that the idea is you can then essentially, they make sure that the model will correctly predict the existing travel pattern. And then what it measures is over time, as demographics change, jobs are added in this traffic zone, housing is added there, it will keep balancing as close to the same pattern so that if, as you have right now, people tend to work in San Francisco. People who live in San Mateo County work in San Francisco or head south. As the jobs are added in San Francisco, as jobs are added in Silicon Valley to the south, you will then see that model changing. And as it's updated, it will calibrate to what are the existing patterns, as opposed to validating any individual project.
Right. So I understand that it's you're continually updating the estimates. I was just wondering if any actual validation was done, and it sounds like you just keep it up to date, but don't track like historical accuracy of your projects 10 years ago. Those are just in the past, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, because it's averaging over traffic zones as opposed to individual projects.
Right.
Okay. Any other questions on methodology? Yeah.
I have a question about delta accuracy. So in terms of plus or minus, what are we talking about in terms of accuracy for this 5% or 95% or 0%?
Okay.
Well, that's a very good question. I think I would have to delve into the study which this is based on, which is as I say, it's a US EPA study which has been endorsed by a number of jurisdictions. I'm unable to give you a firm answer on that question, but the study is based on, I believe it's close to 50 different comparable sites.
And we can get back to you on the expected accuracy of that number.
Thank you.
Any other questions on methodology? I know you have a question on 2010 baseline, but we're going to get to that.
Well, I don't want to ask too many questions. I just want to hear what people have to say, because otherwise we will not have a chance to hear what the...
Yeah, and we will talk about that. The first analysis that's done in the traffic study is what's called an existing plus project. And existing plus project is one of those odd SQL requirements that says if we take the world as it exists today, traffic as it exists today, and take, in this case, Baylands traffic and add it to the existing traffic, but nothing else in the world changes, this is what happens. And what happens is these 6 intersections will not meet applicable level of service standards. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I say it's existing plus project is odd is when was the last time anywhere we saw a project get built and nothing changed in the surrounding area. But SQL requires that this be done. The city of Sunnyvale had a very difficult time arguing why this isn't a good metric. They lost, and so now every EIR and every traffic study analyze this. But basically what this says is 6 intersections are operating at acceptable level of service that when you add project traffic will not. And these are the intersections. Now, cumulative conditions. Cumulative conditions are what we just talked about in the model. When you take existing, you add the Baylands, you add all the traffic that's expected, that the SF Champ model says is going to be generated within the Bay Area over the next, through 2030. When you add the series of projects proposed and approved in San Francisco and Daly City, and put all of that into the model, 17 or 14 intersections do not operate at appropriate level of service.
Is this prior to traffic mitigation or including?
This is prior to mitigation. We'll talk about mitigation and how that really affects. So this right now we're just talking about impacts. And so Old County Road at Bayshore operates at level of service C without Baylands development, add Baylands development, but these cumulative conditions even without any Baylands traffic. So the rest of the world builds out, nothing happens at the Baylands. You're going to see 14 of those 18 intersections that are analyzed in this EIR not operate at appropriate levels of service. So just the changes in the world around you are going to impact 14 of these intersections. And obviously, when you then add Baylands development, that adds to or exacerbates the impacts. And this is before mitigation.
So you will have more intersections than 14, right? If you add Bayshore to it?
Yeah. Now, so when you look at, and this is looking specifically at, and I'll go back just to make sure I got this right. So under cumulative conditions, this is project and Baylands. I got ahead of myself. 14 intersections do not operate at appropriate levels of service. 6 intersections.
Okay,
Yep.
so are we talking about, at this point, these 14 do not include the Baylands period, any of the,
Well,
Yeah, it says it.
yeah.
without-
okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
cumulative conditions. This
Okay.
is this one is, I'll be
Okay.
clear, this one is with the Baylands.
Oh, this is with.
This is with the Baylands.
With any of the projects?
Yeah, this with the Baylands and all the other projects. So let's go back. And these 6 existing plus project, this is Baylands, nobody else. So you see Geneva at Bayshore. So intersections start failing on Bayshore just by adding Baylands traffic to the existing. Cumulative, when you start adding Baylands and everybody else, 14 intersections are failing. When you look at cumulative background traffic, you never build anything else on the Baylands. Nothing ever gets developed, and San Francisco and Daly City and everybody else gets to go ahead with their projects because you can't say, we don't get to say what they get to do. Geneva and Bayshore will not operate at appropriate level of service. San Bruno and Bayshore, Beatty and Alana in and around the interchange, the Sierra Point interchange, Lagoon Way at Tunnel, Lagoon Way at Sierra Point Parkway, under your existing level of service standards are all going to fail. Your general plan standards will not be met just because of development occurring outside the city. And that's the critical point. Baylands obviously adds to that, but when you talk about, the city of Brisbane has a level of service standard, the reality of having set that service standard, and this is one of the things you're talking about, do we actually validate these models? 20 years ago, the understanding of how traffic would be generated 20 years later is different than it is today. So, and that is part of what you have in your general plan. That was a 1990s prediction of what traffic would be like 20 years in the future. And so now we know that 20 years from now into the future, even without development of the Baylands, you're going to see intersections failing. So that's the roadways. And we'll talk about mitigation in a minute. Transit service, when you start adding the Baylands and all of those projects, what we know is because of the Baylands are going to add about 2% to BART. BART is now projected to run over capacity. BART knows that its long-term projections show that it does not have existing capacity for future demand. And the Baylands represents less than 2% of that increase, and based on the way that BART determines, or the way that we determine what is the significant impact, adding that less than 2% increase is not identified as a significant impact, but it is important that you as a commission know and understand the projection for BART is running over capacity. Caltrain, there's an interesting situation that occurs with Caltrain, and that is when you take the Baylands and all the development to the north in San Francisco, there is a major increase in transit demand occurring at the Bayshore station. Not surprising. There is adequate capacity on the Caltrain trains. But the way they run their trains now, it doesn't have enough stops at the Bayshore station to pick up all the people that are going to be there. So that's why we say that there is adequate capacity on Caltrain, but to meet this increased demand for service, Caltrains will need to change its service in terms of stops at the Bayshore station. So there need to be more stops at the Bayshore station, but there's room on the trains to put, over a period of a day, I think it's some 6,000 new riders.
But then it's going to affect the other stations nearby, right? If you're going to add the station, stop at Bayshore, more of that, the way they schedule that is a staggered scheduling. So like 5:14 trains stop at certain stations, 5:17 some others.
Correct.
So it's going to have an impact all along the line. So just by saying that they change the service here at Bayshore, increase the stops over, it's going to have an overall impact on the entire Caltrain scheduling.
It ripples through through their entire system. You don't just say, okay, we're now going to stop every train here, because it changes the schedule in both directions, and that's why what we've identified is they would have to make those changes in service to accommodate the ridership demand at the Caltrain station.
So what's the possibility of doing that? The Caltrains will be able to do that based on the demands in Mountain View and other stations also? Yeah,
based on looking at there's two things we looked at. One is there capacity within the system on the trains themselves? So it's a scheduling issue rather than, BART, there aren't enough trains, there aren't enough cars, there isn't enough capacity.
You're speaking
of
Caltrain.
Yeah. Caltrain has capacity in the system, but the design of the current system in terms of the stops, scheduling, and so on will not accommodate demand that will be generated at the Bayshore station.
So Caltrain does have enough cars to accommodate that.
Yeah.
According to your study. And
Fair and Pierce study shows it's not over capacity, but there aren't enough trains stopping at Bayshore.
The other question is that in case there is a high-speed rail, then how it's going to impact the service, because their recent move is to be on the same tracks as Caltrains. So now the two of the systems are running on the same tracks, so that even creates even more uncertainty in terms
of their ability. Yeah,
right.
Exactly. We know that on San Francisco Muni, that increased ridership will start exceeding capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of SamTrans, very little transit demand going south, and so no real impacts on SamTrans. Now,
do you know if Muni is planning on coming down closer past, in some place Muni does go to the Daly City BART. Do you know if Muni is actually thinking about increasing their area into San Mateo County in this direction?
The one, yeah, and as talked about at the beginning, the extension of the T third line to the Bayshore station.
Okay, thank you.
So, this is, and we've talked about the impacts, and this is actually the level of service standard as it is in the Brisbane General Plan. Level of service D, which is, if I remember right, about 80% of the capacity of an intersection, and delay at peak hours, but you're not sitting there through 2 or 3 cycles. Except at 2 intersections, level of service C, which is more like 70% capacity and less delay. Then there's the phrase that follows is at those 2 intersections that say level of service C, it said that level of service C shall not be degraded as a result of impacts from other intersections within the city or other projects in the city and impacts to be mitigated. So I think as you look at intersections, it's easy to figure out, we can count, traffic people can count how many cars and trucks are in an intersection. What are all their turning movements? How does that work during a peak hour? What is much more difficult is where did that traffic come from in the first place? So that will be one of the issues to think about. And then also thinking about this policy in relation to what I just said in terms of some intersections, even just from outside development, are going to not meet that standard. So you'd asked about mitigation measures. For each of the intersections that do not meet standards, whether they are within San Francisco, within Daly City, within Brisbane, Caltrans jurisdiction, there are specific improvements that the mitigation measures call for. And the mitigation measures are all prefaced the same way, and that is that the improvements be constructed and accepted for maintenance prior to the time that any development is issued an occupancy permit that would cause that intersection to fall below the standard, or that would contribute traffic to an intersection already that doesn't meet that standard. So in this case, what would be expected to meet this mitigation measure, you would then see site-specific traffic studies to determine whether these sets of mitigation measures are triggered at any one of the 18 intersections or however many intersections where mitigation measures are required. So in this case, from a specific project to an intersection, because they're closer, easier to track, and you would be able to determine based on actual counts at the time what are the characteristics of that intersection. There are also mitigation measures related to the Geneva Avenue extension and the interchanges, that similar language saying that the improvements need to be constructed and accepted for public maintenance before an occupancy permit is issued by the City of Brisbane that would cause those standards not to be met. So this is how individual site-specific projects would be tied to specific mitigation measures. And here is something else that's very critical. You can impose easily mitigation measures within the City of Brisbane. You can require that physical improvements be made by a developer within your city. You can identify the mitigation measures and the physical improvements that would be needed to intersections in San Francisco. You can identify the improvements that would be needed in Daly City because of Brisbane's development. But you cannot require San Francisco or Daly City to say, sure, the developer of the Baylands or any developer within your city can come and modify our intersections. And so what you will see is, even though we have identified the needed mitigation, even though we have said that many of those can and should be accepted by those cities, the findings of the EIR say the impacts are unavoidable because you can't guarantee the actual impact. Now, there is also another case on some of the intersections, particularly in San Francisco, where you have the T line and other lines. It's simply not physically possible to make some of the improvements without taking the transit out of the street. And so the EIR also identifies some intersections where they're simply not physically feasible to provide the mitigation. Those are all identified.
I have been curious. So it is up to us here to decide where Caltrain station is going to be?
No.
Well, that's what I wanted to know.
No.
So
There's only...
So I mean, where are we going with this? I just don't understand.
In the end, there is really one entity who will decide where the Caltrain station goes, and that's Caltrain.
Caltrain.
So wherever we may say, oh, it's going to move south, what the EIR says, that's based on the study that San Francisco, I think it was MTA, did.
Right.
And then there's letters from San Francisco, no, it ought to move north, it ought to move there. They're doing a study to move it north. The reality is Caltrain will decide where it goes, and the analysis of traffic is based on the most current study of what's going to happen to that station that Caltrain participated in, which is moving south a couple hundred feet.
Okay, so once they make the decision, then no matter how we plan it, they'll just pretty much take over the land and put it in, or how is that going to work? Do you have a clue?
Yeah, well, I don't know how hard line they'll be, but
Right.
here's the typical way that it would happen. Caltrain as a public agency will coordinate with both you, the City of Brisbane, and the City of San Francisco as to where is the ideal location for their station. And that will, ultimately, Caltrain will make that decision, but there will be coordination with both cities, and you'll make your argument, they'll make theirs. Caltrain will look at how does how does their operation work best and make their decision. But there will be coordination with both agencies.
Okay.
Okay. Now, one of the questions that had come up that Commissioner Manier had asked about a couple of times is the 2010 baseline, and how does that work when it's now 2015 and we're 5 years later. First of all, the baseline year is set by requirements under CEQA, which is the time of the notice of preparation, which was 2010. While there was a later notice of preparation, that later notice of preparation, I believe, was 2012 or 14, really talked about the water supply agreement potential. And so the 2010 notice of preparation is the one that really described the project. So that is used throughout. Now, a couple things as we talked about with the SF-CHAMP model. The SF-CHAMP model projected growth in the Baylands through 2030. So that projected a series of developments. It projected economic growth, both employment growth, housing growth, recreation growth, and all that is embedded in the model throughout the 9-county region. What Fair and Peers did was then take the projects that we know about. Visitation Valley redevelopment, the Schlage Lock project, the Executive Park development, Candlestick Hunters Point Shipyard, the India Basin shoreline, Daly City, and all that they want to do in and around the Cow Palace. And what they did to the model was take out whatever development SF-CHAMP said would occur in those project areas and put what was actually approved in those project models, so that the cumulative without project addresses MTC's or San Francisco MTA's 20-year projections of growth through 2030, as well as these specific projects, and then that's the cumulative without project, and the Baylands was added to that.
But now we're talking about 2040, right? According to the developer, they're saying it's going to be 2040. So in this analysis, are you going to project until 2040 what it's going to be?
No. The traffic model as it exists and the best available analysis will take us through 2030 growth.
Yeah, the other question that puzzling me is that we start with 2010. We use this projection, which is half of the time correct, half of the time not correct. It's basically based on what model you use. How can you have any kind of confidence that 2010 we're studying this and the project will not start until 2040, 2050? 40 years ago we did this analysis to see what will be in the ground in 2040. To me, it doesn't make any sense. For me, the EIR should be within there should be some kind of time frame that your projection of the project is 5 years from now, then we start. But if your projection is 30 years down the line, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Let's back up a step, because I've heard a couple times, the development isn't going to start till 2040. All the information we were given in putting together the analysis, the information that Fair and Peers was given, is that phase one, which would be the first increments of development, would start developing within about, I think it was 5 years of a city action. And so the traffic analysis is based on that development starting in that time frame. The air quality analyses are based on development starting in that time frame. And I know the applicant is here, and I can't speak to starting in 2040 because that's not consistent with any of the information we've seen for the.
Well, at last meeting, that's what he stated.
No.
25 years from now. I think that's what I heard.
I think end point, but I'll let.
Okay.
I'll let.
Maybe I didn't hear correctly.
Yeah.
I'll let them talk. The applicant talk about the starting point. Okay, we've heard a lot about high-speed rail, and I'll run through this fairly quickly because high-speed rail was recognized in the EIR. It was recognized from notice of preparation comments going all the way back to 2010. The environmental impact report did look at including an alternative that would include a high-speed rail yard, and for a couple reasons, and I'll run through those reasons, that was not included as an alternative. To say it's not included as an alternative does not mean you cannot consider it. That is for you to consider in making your recommendation. But here are the issues we go ahead.
So are you saying then we can say that we want to have it considered in the EIR or not in the EIR?
And here's the question I'll ask. And this is the problem we faced. If we were going to consider high-speed rail in the EIR, the first thing I need to know is, or anybody writing an analysis needs to know, so how big is the maintenance yard? There is a 2010 study, and I'll come back to this slide. There is a 2010 study that includes the Baylands as a potential site for a 100-acre maintenance yard. The High-Speed Rail Authority came back 2 years later, and some of their basic assumptions on high-speed rail changed. So there was a supplemental alternatives analysis done by the authority in 2012 that looked at what are the implications of electrification of the Caltrain line. And the 2012 study refers to a reduced fleet size for high-speed rail, which means that they may or may not need a 100-acre maintenance facility. And so they cannot tell you with certainty today, one, where that maintenance yard is. They can say, well, we kind of like the Baylands because it's logical. They may or may not say that. They have not made that decision. With certainty, the decision on the size of the rail yard is not defined. And they're working through it because, and then when you ask, can we analyze in the Baylands EIR the impacts of a high-speed rail yard? I would say yes, if only I knew what the project description for that maintenance yard actually was. So,
okay, now what is the difference between taking what they said in 2010? I mean, most everything we're looking at is what people are saying in 2010 and applying it, but why is it different that we wouldn't take what they were saying in 2010 and apply it to this EIR? I don't understand the difference.
Because,
that's why I'm confused.
Yeah, 2010 is the physical baseline against which impacts are measured. In 2010, there was the way it would work, in 2010, there was no rail yard at the Baylands. And so if a rail yard would be there in the future, we would measure the impacts from 2010 to when there's a rail yard there. These are the impacts of the rail yard. What we know is that the study, and that study could have been 2009, 2011, the year of their first analysis is not critical to the Baylands. What we know is the 100-year assumption that they have is being rethought. And second, I would argue that do you as a city, and this is a recommendation you can make, but I'll ask you this question. Do you as a city want to take on analyzing the impacts of a project being proposed by another public agency who themselves is required to undergo CEQA analysis? So once they have a project, once they know what their operations are on the San Jose-San Francisco line, once they have a proposal that says this is where we want our maintenance yard, whether it's Brisbane or somewhere else, and the maintenance yard is going to be this big, and it's going to have this level of operations, because we don't know what level of operations they're proposing there other than the plan that's now outdated. It's, under the law, it's the High-Speed Rail Authority's responsibility to analyze their project. And there's one other thing as you consider high-speed rail, and that is, and I'm going back one, that the overarching, the EIR analyzes alternatives. One of the ways is based on meeting the objectives of the project, not the objectives of the applicant, but what are the city's objectives in reviewing anything that we might recommend. So one of the things to do, and one of the things to look at as you make your recommendations, go back into Chapter 3 and look at project objectives. And the overarching objectives defined in the EIR for whatever might ultimately be approved in the Baylands is that it be an active, vibrant place which strengthens the community of Brisbane.
But that's the problem I have with this whole logic, because if we increase the garbage sunset scavenger, that doesn't meet that criteria. If we put there's several projects that we're looking at that do not meet that criteria. So why is this one singled out? I mean, the lumberyard, that doesn't quite meet that project. I don't understand this.
Then here, as you're making your findings at the end,
right,
one of the findings that you will be that to think about is, does whatever you're saying ought to be approved meet the objectives set forth for the Baylands, or do you want to change the objectives? And you have the ability to make that recommendation also. So where you're making your recommendations regarding the EIR, regarding whatever development, you look at, these are the objectives that were laid out. We may want to change those. We may want to, however you want to do that. That's yours to recommend. But in terms of why there was not an alternative in the EIR that had a high-speed rail yard, two basic reasons. One was the view of me as a consultant and staff, the rail yard not necessarily consistent with the objective that was laid out, and not enough information to actually analyze. It is analyzed, and it is identified, and let me go to in Chapter 6, one of the requirements under CEQA is to look at cumulative projects. What other projects are out there, and how does what's being proposed on the Baylands fit with all of that? The letter from the High-Speed Rail Authority was that they appreciated acknowledging high-speed rail and including it in their potential maintenance and storage facility in Chapter 6, which is the analysis of cumulative impacts. So from that standpoint, it was analyzed and is part of the analysis of cumulative impacts. The last thing I just wanted to mention on high-speed rail is there was a comment that part of it's under construction. The part that's under construction is from Merced to Fresno, or I guess if you're in Fresno, they say Fresno to Merced. And then they're also looking at the design from Fresno down to Bakersfield. Impacts on the 101 freeway. Obviously, it's not operating at any acceptable level of service today. Adding Baylands development will exacerbate those problems. People noted that the EIR was not proposing mitigation, in particularly widening of the freeway. So while there's mitigation in terms of interchange, why has the EIR not proposed widening the freeway? One is Caltrans has no plans to widen the freeway. It's their freeway, and they're the only ones who can actually widen it. The city has no authority to require Caltrans to do that. Even if we would identify, okay, it ought to be widened through the Baylands, that's not going to accomplish anything. It just creates a funnel at each end, and so widening through the Baylands doesn't do that. And Caltrans has in the past identified physical constraints that would preclude widening both to the north and the south. So given all that, it seems it seems frustrating, I know, to people who drive that freeway. Why is nobody doing anything? But from this project standpoint, from any individual project standpoint, addressing the problems on the 101 is far bigger than, it's something Caltrans has to do because it's a regional issue. And if Caltrans had a program to widen that freeway, you'd see a mitigation measure in here. If there were local contributions to that widening, there would certainly be that mitigation measure. But we can't force Caltrans into doing that.
But we are making it worse, right, by adding more traffic.
Yeah. Any development anywhere along the 101 is going to make it worse. Yeah.
I have a related question, though. The Geneva Avenue extension includes a freeway on-ramp improvement, doesn't it?
Yes.
Are there issues with jurisdiction with that? Is that going to be a difficult project to arrange, or how is that going to work?
That's part of, remember, a bi-county study that's being done between San Francisco, San Mateo County, cities of Brisbane and Daly City. Caltrans has been involved in that. Ultimately, it will require Caltrans approval of project reports and design, but Caltrans has been one of the parties at the table. Essentially, they're saying, I'll make this probably more crass than they're actually saying, San Francisco and all the folks in San Mateo will pay for it, we'll approve the design, and you can pay for improvement on that. Because the other thing that it does is it takes ultimately a lot of traffic off another interchange farther north.
So do we get a sense of how much Brisbane is supposed to pay for this Geneva exchange?
The fair share disbursements as to how it will be done have not been finalized. We can make sure we can have the city engineer, public works director, speak to that at a later meeting.
Okay.
But
That'd be helpful.
ultimately, I think when you say how much is the city paying, I think out of the city coffers, the correct answer would be nothing.
Okay.
Or that's certainly the desire. Questions about transportation demand management, and what I'll say on transportation demand management. That is a program that is mandatory through CCAG. CCAG has regulations that any project that has more than 100 peak hour trips required to do transportation demand management mitigation. And what the EIR is doing is simply saying we recognize the CCAG program. That is part of the process and one of the mitigation measures that needs to be undergone. Transit use, we've talked about how the transit assumptions were made. The simple formula, or the simple idea is transit use is highest when people are closest to transit. If I have to get in my car to drive to a transit station, I'm likely to stay in that car, especially when, I can't miss this one, the Daly City BART station doesn't have enough parking, and it tells me I should have taken transit to the BART station, and I'm going to Oakland. I just stayed in my car and drove to Oakland. But within the Baylands, the idea is there will be greater transit use, basically when it's a walking or biking distance of a third of a mile, and decreasing use as you move farther away. I'll do a quick discussion of noise and vibration. Obviously, there are some major noise sources, the freeway, Caltrain, Bayshore Boulevard, some industrial sources, and the airport. And even though the city of Brisbane and the Baylands are outside of the 65 decibel contour line, which is typically where airports find noise problems, large number of noise complaints come from Brisbane because flying over Brisbane at night, you can hear those planes very easily. Averaged over a day, it doesn't meet the typical standards, and we have recognized that in the EIR. And actually, SFO requested that if the commission and ultimately council would recommend any residential uses, they have double pane windows, whether they're within a 65 CNEL or not. The other thing that's very important in terms of noise is just the topography of your community. Your community, especially, you can see this when you fly out of San Francisco heading north, and you see a bowl. And the city of Brisbane has a ridge that surrounds it, that basically cuts off noise from other directions and holds noise in from the freeway. The other thing that an amphitheater-like shape does is it means that houses all through the hillside have a great view of the noise sources. So just like seats in an auditorium, and the classic of this is the Hollywood Bowl in Southern California, where everybody has a great view of the stage, and you can actually stand on stage and talk, and sound carries so well that people can hear it. But what happens in Brisbane is because you don't have the typical up and down topography, you don't have flat topography where houses and other buildings cut off noise. Noise travels unimpeded up into the hillsides. And at night, when there's less traffic on the freeway, there's less traffic on the roadways, and background noise is low. Noise is not louder in Brisbane, but it travels really well. And so you hear things at distances long away that you would not hear daytime. And that is one of the issues in dealing with in terms of noise. And so there'll be construction noise impacts, and obviously those will be fairly substantial because construction equipment is loud, and the city does have restrictions on time of construction, other mitigation measures. So with that, I know this went longer than we would normally do, but if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Otherwise, we'll get to the public.
Well, I thank you very much because I did have a lot of questions.
Yeah,
I didn't understand.
Yeah, it's a very complex issue.
Yeah.
So
Anyone
we'll
else?
be here to answer any other questions
Okay,
at
thank
the
you.
end. Thanks.
So no other questions from the commission?
No.
Okay, great. So we can open it up to the public hearing. Again, this is a reminder that this is a continuation, so we don't need any formal motion to open. I have 4 cards, and I know that there was a person that did not give us a card yet. If you intend to speak, please fill out a card. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Claire. Thank you. So 6, anyone else? No? Okay. So, Ms. Miller?
Good evening, Madam Chair and Commission.
Good evening.
Anja Miller. Sorry to risk wearing out my welcome with you, but there's just so few of us who have really had the chance to look at this FEIR, and so those of us, just you have to bear with us, I'm afraid. And my concern, you've heard a lot of the really important points on traffic and transportation, and I may repeat some of that, but my concern is mainly the fact that our people are not aware. Right now, they have no idea of what you've just heard. And so that is the concern. Right now, we who live in Brisbane don't have many traffic problems as long as we aren't trying to go to San Francisco or further down the peninsula on 101. We're fine, going to Trader Joe's and going to our necessities. And actually, to give you an anecdote that is backed by some documentation that we do have, the public transportation we had here in Brisbane decades ago was better than it is today. We had a Greyhound bus that was running on Bayshore every 20 minutes, predictably, and our local little bus turned around and connected to it, and it also went to Tanforan and Bart and even Jefferson High School. Now this was before Samtrans even existed, so we were just melded into Samtrans, but then Samtrans destroyed us, our transit. So now all we had is a Samtrans main line and a commute shuttle, which is good itself, but is not as often and convenient as before. So we need to do more driving than we did before. But this...
Do you know that whether the Samtrans desire to stop serving this area has been settled?
Well, the main line will continue due to the strong objections we gave for their plan to stop it. And San Francisco had something to do with it. They didn't want Samptons to come to San Francisco. So it's complex. But this final EIR, which only a few of us are able to read or pay attention to the traffic impacts described in it, clearly reveals that we'll soon have major traffic problems to affect us even before anything is built on the Baylands, as you just heard. And I'm quoting Master Responses 22 and 23. They make clear that the regional and local traffic impacts that would be contributed both under the sections existing with project as well as cumulative with project by all proposed scenarios, when considered with the traffic from all the massive developments already approved and or underway in San Francisco and Daly City, would be significant and unavoidable. What that means is that 101 will be a parking lot even more often than it is now, and that we'll have great difficulty just getting out of town or back home. Except for letters from San Francisco and Daly City, it's very disappointing that there has been little concern expressed by other cities about these coming unavoidable impacts, not only on Brisbane, but all our neighboring Bayside cities. They're not saying anything, they're just developing themselves. Now, CCAG has its congestion management plan, as quoted in Master Response 24, and associated transportation management programs, but it's highly questionable, to me anyway, how that organization can, quote, enforce those mitigation measures and ensure their effectiveness. CCAG is not an enforcement agency, it's a policy-making group. Master Response 25 cites studies that predict the continuing jobs versus housing imbalance. We heard about that too, in our subregion, and thus the need for housing in the Baylands. So the recommendation to us, you, is that we Brisbane taxpayers should just shoulder the costs to our city for providing this housing mitigation and still accept the unavoidable tremendous coming congestion on our arterial streets. Also, the economy, frankly, you never know when it's going to go up or down, bubbles form and burst, and you have no guarantee that these economic projections of jobs will actually materialize. And not only that of the impact, we are expected to willingly change our very good workable current general plan to allow major reduction in the levels of service at our main intersections. That's what you're being asked to do. Those reasonable levels are currently setting the limits to unreasonable development within our borders. Actually, to provide better understanding of what is meant in real life with the various levels of service, I hope your commission will invite Carol Nelson, Brisbane's former planning director, to present to you a fuller description and justification for that part of the general plan, which she knows better than anyone. You heard some description of that, but I do think you need more detail, exactly what it would mean for you to get out of this time. Master Response 27 claims that trip generation studies in 2007 and 2010 are, quote, appropriate as a baseline for projections of future traffic impacts. We all know that there's an accelerating building boom, especially in San Francisco, and that 2015 traffic is already much heavier than the baseline. More studies are definitely needed before any certification of this EIR. Those studies should also address the effect of the ever-increasing commuter demand on heavy and light rail transit, including the combination of Caltrain and high-speed rail. And I understand Caltrain commute time right now is very, very full. Finally, I'd like to bring to your attention that the most knowledgeable member of our ad hoc citizens committee is currently indisposed and unable to offer you her valuable comments. So I hope someone else will read her comments to you. Beyond that, we all feel that there needs to be much more public information about all these impacts discussed, not only from the proposed development of the Baylands, but the unavoidable impacts of developments and recommended mitigations that we have no control over in the wider region. The least you can do right now is to schedule another hearing on tonight's topic later on in your program, have the necessary presentations, and really try to get the public to hear and understand what we are being asked to do. On the noise, I haven't read too much, but I was on the Airport Land Use Commission in my time, and the 65 measure that's being mentioned is CNEL, not dBA. The decibels are individual noise events. 65 is a region or area that's designated as a community noise equivalency level, CNEL. We're talking about 65. Brisbane is in the 65 CNEL area. It's an algorithm including ambient noise and other things over the 24-hour period. So that's why we can't have much help to alleviate noise, because we're in that region of 65 CNEL, not dBA. Thank you.
Thank you. So the two additional forms, one notes 1 minute, but one does not note any time, so we're still in the 3-minute mark. Ms. Maynard?
Thank you, Commissioners. Let's do this better. I'm Susan Sullivan Maynard. I'm a member of the Complete Streets Advisory Committee to the City Council, and as such have been attending the Geneva-Hartney feasibility study with the San Francisco MTA. And that feasibility study has recently concluded, and last week they held a community outreach meeting to discuss location of the intermodal station that would connect San Francisco Muni with Caltrain, essentially in the Baylands area, and was looking for feedback from the community on that. So that project is still, according to the MTA, still in study phase. No decisions have been made as far as I know. I would like to make one comment is I went online looking for information about this meeting. This really substantial report from John was not available online to read before the meeting, and I find that to be a great limitation in providing feedback to you. I have two major issues in looking at my perspective from Complete Streets and from the Geneva-Hartney study, is that the Baylands is not looking at a coordinated transit plan. Brisbane sits in the middle of a major north-south corridor and on the edge of what's becoming a major east-west transit corridor as the Candlestick Park Hunters Point transit develops and is planned by San Francisco MTA.
I'm sorry, can you just go back and say that all again? It's a little, I want to make sure I actually heard it.
So traditional traffic patterns flow north-south through Brisbane into San Francisco, from San Francisco through Brisbane south to the peninsula. There's a new traffic pattern developing that will flow east-west, possibly across Brisbane Baylands, of new developments in Hunters Point, Candlestick Park, down Geneva Avenue, and out to the Balboa Park Station. Mm-hmm. So San Francisco MTA is looking at connecting travelers not to downtown BART stations, but west to Balboa Park BART station, which happens to be, I think, the third most busiest station in the BART system.
So what you're talking about is like a horseshoe?
That's still under discussion. The current Geneva-Harney plan says that it's feasible to put bus rapid transit on Geneva Avenue. It's feasible to put bus rapid transit east of 101 through Candlestick Point. The problem area is between Bayshore and Highway 101. That's where Brisbane Baylands are. That's where the Schleglock development is. And there's another transit development study that's going to look at how to run bus rapid transit from these proposed population development areas across to Balboa Park BART station. So that's issue number one. The second issue I have is in all the reading that I've found and the developments, one detail that seems to be overlooked in a great variety of these reports are the amount of bicycle transportation that runs north-south through the edge of Brisbane, that comes down Tunnel Road, comes up Bayshore. And while in one of the reports I was reading in preparation for this meeting said that less than 1% of Brisbane population commutes, we have hundreds of bicycles coming out of San Francisco flowing south to jobs on the peninsula. And in planning for the Baylands, just as we need to consider car traffic on 101, riders on Caltrain, riders on Samtrans, we also need to consider this major through traffic on a different form of transportation, bicycles. So that's what I have.
Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah. So I was at a meeting with you, and Caltrains is starting to develop a problem with being able to, they've reached a capacity for the bicycles. And does that enter into any of the things you're saying?
What I'm seeing more are people who, rather than ride their bicycle to a train station, but we do have dedicated Brisbane residents that do that. People ride from San Francisco to South San Francisco, Mountain View, in quite a few cases. Sometimes they ride in small groups, sometimes they ride in relatively large organized groups, and it's not just a weekday commute. So Caltrain capacity for people with their bicycles on trains, yes, that is an issue. Caltrain knows that they're not providing enough specific cars that are designed to hold bicycles for the capacity that, for the demand that they have from riders. That's not the issue that I'm looking at for the Baylands. I'm looking at people who are on their bicycles coming through City of Brisbane property and heading north and south and not stopping in Brisbane. Does that answer your question?
So did you have a sense of when the report is going to come out, the Geneva-Harley Transit Study Report?
So the feasibility study has been published, and it is online. I have a paper copy at home. The next step would be to, I'm not sure what they're calling the next step, but the next step would be involved more detailed planning on specifically street reconfiguration, route configuration, bus timings. And the problem area still remains between Bayshore and 101 because there are physical space limitations. However, they all take a step back in the feasibility study and say by 2040, the assumption is Geneva Avenue will be extended across the Baylands, and there will be some coordinated bus link with the T, with the bus rapid transit, with Caltrain.
So what you're saying with this study is that they are not thinking at this point about making this sort of not horseshoe, maybe horseshoe at this point? Or I mean, do you know what the timeline is?
The Geneva Harney study was a feasibility study and looked at two time frames, 2020 and 2040. By 2020, they expected to run buses from Candlestick Point across to Balboa Park BART station with dedicated bus lanes on Geneva and with dedicated bus lanes on Harney out to Candlestick Point. What they were not able to determine in the feasibility study would be to how to structure the bus route between Bayshore Boulevard and 101.
Okay.
And there was too many factors to consider to make a valid decision. Street widths going through Little Hollywood, whether or not to run the Muni bus down to the train station, what Recology was going to allow or not allow, and what streets were going to be available in the Recology remodel, so that could a bus route be not go through Little Hollywood but come south through the Recology property. So those were all issues, but it still comes down to the wedge of land between Bayshore Boulevard and Highway 101 for Geneva Harney bus rapid transit. That's the problem area for them. Now, in 2040, what they would love to see is a Geneva Avenue extension with a coordinated bus rapid transit, a connection to the light rail, all in the middle of the Baylands development. And that, of course, implies a connection across 101 with access under or through the freeway to get to Candlestick Point as well. So.
Wow. Thank you very much. I'm so happy you came down to give us this report.
It's my 2 cents. I need to get my tires pumped up and back on my bike.
Thank you. So in the second round of speaker cards, Mr. Verrios?
Tony Verrios. My concern is that, number one, backup beepers right now from the ridge where we live, we hear them every night. I can't even figure out exactly where they're coming from, but they're very piercing. You've all heard them before. And I'm not sure. Recology tells us that they're working on trying to find some kind of alternative that's acceptable to OSHA, but I'm not complaining about their beepers per se, just beepers in general. Added traffic noise. Traffic noise is the number one noise that we deal with. People are always complaining about the airplanes, but the airplanes, as frequently as they fly, aren't my number one problem up on the ridge, even though they fly right over our house. They've made the engines so much quieter that unless they're older planes and in a steep climb or coming, blasting right through, it's just not that bad and they don't last that long. But we've had no success in getting them to fly higher before they get to Brisbane, and that's really the issue. It's the elevation. They're too low when they come over. Otherwise, they would be a negligible problem, in my opinion. I see here that in the major noise addressed in the final EIR, there's a section that says major issues addressed, and the last line of it says, because the noise model employed by the draft EIR does not assume any acoustical shielding, the noise levels projected in the EIR are appropriate. That may be clear to the staff people that wrote it, but I have no idea what that means, except that I don't think that the current noise levels that we're subjected to are appropriate. They're not acceptable to me, for sure, and I'm blessed with really good ears. I'm not concerned. It's irritating to hear the traffic that just goes up primarily Guadalupe Canyon Parkway, because that is a raceway and people abuse that road. And I wish that road was closed to everything except for emergency traffic from here, from Mission Blue Drive to Guadalupe to Carter. If they just closed that one section, I'd be a happy man. But that's not going to happen. That's a state road. So I would like to see the commission specifically look at the acceptable decibel limits, the noise limits that are acceptable in the city of Brisbane, and consider the whole city, not just downtown, and look at reducing those. So, and especially with concern for things like these backup beepers that can keep people from sleeping. As much as we get emergency sirens, we don't get as many from Brisbane as we get from Geneva and San Francisco. Those things we hear, but we've been hearing them all our life, and it just doesn't seem to be quite so annoying. But when you're in a nice sleep and all of a sudden you get this beep, 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 it's almost like having a mosquito in your ear, and I can't get used to that. So thank you for considering my comments.
Thank you. Ms. Ebel?
Greetings and salutations. Barbara Ebel, 349 San Bruno Avenue. I have both some comments of my own, and I'm here with Colleen Mackin's comments because she was not feeling well. I would like to start with Colleen's comments. Transportation and circulation. 3 letters, LOS, are the most important you need to know in any discussion about traffic and the Baylands. LOS stands for level of service, and it's used to describe whether you are moving fast, at or above the speed limit, level A, expeditiously, at the speed limit, level B, moderately, which is to say near the speed limit, at level C, with declining speed at level D, at capacity with maneuverability extremely limited, level E, or in a breakdown, flow bottleneck, or a standstill, level F. The 1994 Brisbane General Plan says that the residents should be able to comfortably travel across town and gain access to Highway 101. It also says that the level of service on all streets should not be below level D. If you think this is a little bit like a grading system, level D sounds like a pretty low bar to me, but that's my interjection. And supposedly it states, and it purposely states that on Bayshore and Old County, at the Old County intersection and at the San Bruno intersection, the level of service shall not be less than C. The developer used a July 2007 study to show that service levels at various Brisbane intersections in the north part of the Baylands down to San Bruno Avenue at its southernmost point. This study, that the City and County of San Francisco deems conservative and unclear whether it takes into account the post-recession 2010 or 2012 traffic counts or Candlestick and 100-point shipyard plans. Does an 8-year-old study adequately reflect current conditions? When you talk about activity at the Baylands and traffic, you cannot forget the cumulative impacts of more than 15,000 new housing units to our north in San Francisco and in Daly City. This does not even take into consideration the additional housing and commercial development to our south on the peninsula. You can see the offices being built at Oyster Point and the future Centennial Tower 2 at Sister Cities. So when the developer proposes any traffic mitigation plans, you have to stop to consider whether adding better timing to traffic lights or another turn lane on Geneva Ave and Bayshore or even additional lanes to existing roadways will mitigate the cumulative impacts of development around the Baylands and south of Brisbane. Caltrans said, we find significant underestimate of AM generated trips while comparing generated traffic of table 4.N-15 versus that of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and recommends revising accordingly. Caltrans further recommends studying intersections from the south that inhibit traffic going to and from the project site. Daly City says that the developer's analysis of traffic assumes transit and roadway improvements that have not been approved nor funded. Some mitigation measures assume that the Daly City will pay for the improvements instead of the project developer or government agencies where the project is located. Daly City further writes, mitigation measure 4.N-1A states that it would require action by the City of Daly City, but does not specify which entity would be required to finance these changes to ensure that the mitigation measures are undertaken. San Francisco's Planning Department writes, we believe that there could be conflicts that would arise out of siting high-density commercial office, institutional, residential, or open space uses in close proximity to the Recology site. Traffic increases from future Baylands activities could conflict with the necessary truck and vehicular access to and from the Recology site and on nearby streets. This could result in transportation impacts not only with respect to truck and vehicle traffic, but also to planned bus, rapid transit, pedestrian, bicycle routes throughout the area. San Francisco further asserts transit mitigation measures 4.N-7 and 4.N-9 are too vague and lack the specificity or clarity necessary to understand what is being proposed. How the measures would be implemented or funded, or how effective they would be in terms of mitigating identified impacts. Developers refer to future study without specific criteria or effectiveness. San Francisco Planning Development says that without including high-speed rail as a reasonably foreseeable rather than speculative alternative, there is a hole in the EIR, leaving decision makers guessing what level of mixed-use development can avoid many of the significant transportation impacts. The developer proposes mitigating transportation impacts by encouraging the use of public transit such as Caltrain. Caltrain says that adding 5,900 to 10,000 trips to their system at the Bayshore system will have a significant impact on their capacity, and that assumptions about their ability to support this increased level of ridership should be documented. San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency supports transit-oriented development, but also says mitigation measures are often vague and not specific enough. They cite impacts to San Francisco transit operations from the Baylands and the necessary to contribute to the capital costs for increased transit, and also the years of lead time to procure additional vehicles and develop new plans. So the final word I believe you are with is significant and unavoidable. That is what you're looking at with the developer DSP and community-sponsored plans CSP at the Baylands. Are you okay with a Highway 101 traffic already spilling over onto Bayshore? The 15,000 plus housing projects, I think she meant 15 units, and San Francisco's Hunter Point, Candlestick, and Daly City aren't completed. They add significant development to the Baylands, and then to the south. Now trying to imagine getting home to Brisbane. We have limited entry and egress to our town, and increased traffic will be significant and unavoidable. The cumulative effects of what gets built around us need to be factored in because that's what we're going to end up with. Mr. Scharfman told the Planning Commission recently that he's ready to start development whenever he can. And no matter what he tells you, the transportation hasn't caught up, nor has it been adequately studied. I'm afraid I cannot answer questions on Colleen's notes.
But can we get a copy of that?
I will ask her. I would rather her send that to you herself.
Okay.
And I'm sure she's a very enthusiastic and energetic woman, and I bet no matter how sick she is, she'll find the energy to do that for you.
Okay.
She can forward as an email to
Yeah.
our staff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And she's probably even listening right now. Colleen, send them an email.
I'm sure she is.
And then, would you like me to go on to my notes, or would you like me to give somebody else a turn?
Would it be about 3 minutes? Because I have 2 and they're not identified as to how long.
Okay, I think mine is short. So last time we talked a little bit about, I was up here, I talked a little bit about densification and all these other impacts. And then moving on from the noise and vibration resulting from densification and site preparation, there's also going to be the issue of pile driving to support all of these buildings. And the study assumes that there would be no impact to Old Brisbane due to the distance. From previous experience with Caltrain improvements located within the heart of the Baylands when they built the new station, we know from personal experience that this is not the case, and thus the standards or the study is in error. For supporting data, please see 4.J-32, last paragraph. The pile driving from data from Sierra Point was 91 dBA at 200 foot P. And I don't know what that means, but it comes to a lot. And we don't know how many years this build-out is going to take out, but, 20 years of pile driving is not on my hot list. And then I also, unfortunately, I thought my main stuff, I'm missing something off my tablet. So I'm seriously hoping that you will continue this section because the main thing that I had wanted to present tonight didn't make it on here. But I did want to say that the Bayshore crossing of 101 is not addressed anywhere in the chapter. I see this as an impossible omission, since a large portion of the commuters are expected to travel north to Super District 3. Now, that means there's going to be a lot of, that means most of the traffic's going to be flowing north, and so there's going to be, how these people are going to get from the, it just doesn't make any sense to me, how they're going to get from the Baylands up onto 101 traveling north, let alone what's gonna, there's no main thorough, there's no on-ramp there or anything. Like if it's over where Beatty is, then it's gonna have to be a flyover on 101 or something, or they're all gonna have to go up north to where that, it's always really messy because it's the 101-280 interchange. And also, I'm going to speak just a second about bicycle traffic. Most of the people I know heading north into San Francisco from this area take the 101 on-ramp to get over Bayshore. So you are actually riding on the freeway on-ramp to get over Bayshore from the southern portion of Bayshore to the northern portion of Bayshore. And that's a little dangerous. I think it's perhaps even possibly illegal. And I don't see that's outside of the bounds of this project. So they haven't addressed how all these extra people they're going to encourage to bike are actually going to make that trip over 101 safely at Bayshore. And hopefully I will be back with my other notes later. Thank you.
I would add one more thing to that. There is a railroad crossing right at the Bayshore and where you enter 101. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a major issue also in terms of getting the people out of Bayshore.
Yeah. So it's a really difficult place. So all these people that are going north don't really have a good way to go north because it's outside of the bounds of the project. So thanks.
Okay, I have two remaining speakers, Jonathan Scharfman and Claire Johnson. Do you have an idea of how long?
Good evening, Commissioners. Jonathan Scharfman, UPC, project representing the project sponsor. Just a clarification and a couple of comments. In the staff report, it suggests that the CPP and CPPV scenarios project over 16,000 jobs. And my question for Mr. Zola is that I know my recollection is that the DSP is a marginal number above that, but could you verify what that number is? Is it about 17,000? Oh, so my understanding, Commissioners, is that there's only a marginal additional number of jobs proposed in the DSP from the CPP, and I have one comment and perhaps a suggestion. As you'll learn next week, the science of, however imperfect, of studying traffic patterns, predictive traffic patterns for the number of projected new jobs on sites that are proposed for new development, it simply concludes that the CPP and the CPPV has almost twice the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from those additional trips and the additional length of trip as the DSP, with over 4,000 housing units in addition to it. And so I would just encourage the Commission to take those analyses for what they are, as actually the best science that your consultants can come up with to verify what these impacts might be. But I would also invite you, and this is by way of suggestion, to as commissioners to actually seek to understand a little bit better the projected, to your point, Commissioner Anderson, the projected commuting patterns of these 16,000 workers that might be out here in a CPP scenario. I think it's about 17,000, 17 and a half in a DSP scenario, but that could be verified by the consultants. Because I think that would be important to understand. I sit on the Bay Area Council Transportation Committee. I sit on a similar committee at SAMCETA, the San Mateo County Economic Development Association, and employers really, really care about these things. And I would invite you, since after 3 years of community input, and multiple public hearings, the city council actually concluded that we would like to see up to 8 million square feet of commercial development out there on the Baylands that would result in, according to your consultants' calculations, over 16,000 jobs. So I do suggest that you talk to some of these employers and have really strive to understand what those patterns are and what their concerns are for the quality of life of those folks and their productivity once they actually get to work. And I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson. Oh.
Do you mind? I forgot one thing. So I forgot one note here that I would like to propose to you. So listening to Mr. Zola, it occurs to me that the significant unavoidable impacts are potentially avoidable if we don't issue the occupancy permits. But realistically, how is that going to work? How is a project that is built not going to receive its occupancy permit? I mean, clearly we're within our rights by the law, as stated, but is the city of Brisbane really going to pull that off? Is there going to be a lawsuit? Right? So is that tool really in our toolbox, or is it just, a phantom power? So that's something we need to consider very carefully.
I don't know what you're referring to.
I would prefer Mr. Zola repeat himself, but he said something about City of Brisbane not having the right, or having the right to not issue an occupancy permit for a project. And then I was just curious if Mr. Scharfman's Transportation Board has anything to do with the development of the CHAMPS model in any way, shape, or form. Thank you very much.
First, I'd like to make a reference to Mr. Scharfman's comments. He just said to you that the City Council of the City of Brisbane had already made a decision and that they were in favor of 8 million square feet of commercial space. And I would submit to you that I don't believe that's true. And something that's I feel like I'm kind of being rude by saying this, but in the past, when something like this has occurred, the Planning Commission hearings, usually the proponent makes a presentation at the beginning, and then you have the public hearings, and usually they don't make another presentation at the end. So far here, you've had a presentation at the beginning, interspersed a comment by the proponent throughout the process, which they certainly would have the right to do, and then one at the end. And that seems just, I wondered why, and so you leave it in the air. I wondered why. But the other comments I'd like to make are that in relation to previous comments, I'd certainly agree about the pile driving noise being heard from central Brisbane. And also, there was a comment by Anya about the need for some additional studies because of the increased traffic since we've been lucky enough to be out of the Great Recession, even though parts of California are not. And in Colleen's notes, it is 15,000. Between Hunters Point and Daly City and everything, it's 15,000 housing units, of which 3,250 of them are located either at Schlage in San Francisco or where they're going to tear down Executive Park and put another 1,600 over there. And relating to the overarching objective, of the projects that might be here. There's a strengthening a sense of community. And I guess I would say that although I don't know the answer whether the anaerobic digesters are good or not, I do know that how they could strengthen the community is because they bring in a lot of money that would pay for services. And as far as the high-speed rail, I can only think that it would provide transportation, and it might be a source of money to the community. For my own comments, in the mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plan, on page 463, mitigation measure 4.I-1, I don't agree that the general plan roadway level of service standards should be changed, and therefore I don't support a general plan amendment to do so. In a separate note, I have concluded that DSP, DSPV, CPP, and CPPV are not appropriate for this site. The traffic of the project alternatives is so significant that it cannot be mitigated. I've seen the same entries in the mitigation and monitoring plan that say that and in the responses to comments, that there are some inadequacies according to Caltrans, according to the City and County of San Francisco. And I would submit to you that greater traffic impacts are worse, even though they all may be significant. So when someone says to you, well, we'll still have significant impacts even if we build anything, I still think it's going to make a great deal of difference to your quality of life if they build more. The result is that the quality of life for the people of Brisbane, Visitation Valley, Bayshore, Daly City is going to be adversely impacted. We would be subjected to delays at all arterial intersections and on the freeway and on the streets mentioned within the staff report for this evening's hearing. Our air quality will be worsened, our town's character will be lost, the political center will be changed if housing were built, and community values would change. I believe that any income from this project would be offset by the need for constant monitoring and oversight. I believe that this land is a rail yard that is contaminated, an industrial way that has potentially more contamination, an unengineered landfill on bay mud, a rail line through it. It has upland contaminated land that drains through it. It has a contaminated site beside the lagoon, VWR. It has a regional petroleum distribution facility within it. It has an underground petroleum running under it. You know, what more would you need? It has contaminated, remediated schley site north of it, which is not clean, it's just less contaminated. It is next to the bay, next to a 10-lane freeway, providing primary auto and truck transportation north and south, and a 4-lane arterial on its western border. It has numerous small contamination sites on the other side of the arterial, something which no one talks about because that's not really a part of the EIR. But if you get a map of all the contaminated sites located along Bayshore Boulevard on the other side of the street, you'll find that there's quite a number of them. This site should be lightly developed and carefully developed. The proposal for placing renewable energy in the form of 100 acres of solar panels and perhaps some wind generation in a small format might work. They also propose 1 million square foot of retail. Seems like a lot, but something has to pay for the remediation, the monitoring, and the oversight. The high-speed rail repair facility could help pay for needed services. It must be screened and hidden. The noise from it has to be mitigated. Putting the solar panels...
I'm sorry, I just missed something. Could you go back about 3 or 4 sentences?
About the high-speed rail? Or the 1 million square feet of retail?
Well, let's start with the 1 million square feet of retail. I'm sorry, I just
okay.
Didn't.
They also propose 1 million square feet of retail on the renewable energy side. It seems like a lot, but something has to pay for the remediation, the monitoring, and the oversight. The high-speed rail repair facility could help pay for needed services. It must be screened and hidden if it's built. The noise from it has to be mitigated. Putting the solar panels on noise-attenuated roofs over the tracks might help. Okay. State-of-the-art recovery traps for escaping industrial chemicals should be required. Extensive wetlands could really help the quality of bay water in this localized area. Recreation uses like a velodrome for bicycle racing or an entertainment venue could allow for a limited exposure to potential health threats, and that would be better than constant exposure. It could all fit, including ecology and its anaerobic digesters, properly filtered for air pollutants and odor. Look out for the San Francisco Household Hazardous Waste Facility because it may be coming. Under the issue of noise and vibration, the Brisbane ordinance on noise is about what Anya mentioned, 65 dBA at your property line if you're, say, playing the stereo, and it's or using a tool or something. That's the rules, that you shouldn't exceed 65 dBA. That's one experience, one particular event. The 65 CNEL, as she explained, is something that is over time, and once you reach 65, it takes an awful lot to even raise it because of the mathematics, which I do not understand. And but if you have 64 dBA, it's very noisy. If you've ever had something happen to your car and you get out on the freeway, that's like the level of noise that you're talking about, very loud. So to allow that, which is listed in here as something that's allowable between the common buildings. It does say residential buildings, but I believe it's an issue in all buildings that house people. At that level, you can't hear someone speak to who's standing near you. I think it should be more restrictive when you're talking about the common areas between buildings. 45 dBA interior level is the standard, and so I don't have anything to say about that, but I think outside it should be lower than 64 dBA, which is what is required, what is allowed under this mitigation. A study should be done to determine what is a non-stressful level of exterior noise for most people, and that should determine the exterior standard. There is this kind of research that's done. I know of it in Europe. I know of it in Great Britain. I think the other study I've seen is in the Netherlands. But there's somewhere in the 50s is where the stress level begins to change. It affects people's health if they are exposed over the long term. I think the same should apply concerning noise for the hotels. That's in mitigation measure 4.J-1B. In mitigation measure 4.J-2A, rather than 200 feet from the tracks, I think that the railroad tracks, that the anti-vibration mitigation should apply at 400 rather than 200 feet. I'm sorry, did you not understand what I said?
No, I understood.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. 4J-4A, they talk of temporary plywood noise barriers that they might use. For those to be effective, you need to have some kind of noise attenuation attached to the plywood. And they were discussing in this mitigation measure that there might be people across the street as close as 75 feet. And so you definitely need more than a piece of plywood to attenuate noise. The City of San Francisco comments on traffic and circulation included a concern that the program EIR needed to be done, and certainly I agree with that, and I think there's no problem in restating it. They also said there was no access for bicycles to the BRT-Caltrain hub, and that I agree that must be fixed. The concern that high-intensity use near ecology would result in conflicts, to me the answer for that is to reduce the intensity. Mitigation measures 4.N7 and 4.N9 are too vague and lack the specificity or clarity needed to understand what is being proposed, how the measures would be implemented or funded, or how effective they would be in terms of mitigating identified impacts. I agree with that. And I believe that the mitigation measures are not specific enough. In 4.N-1A, I believe this to be an inadequate mitigation measure. The project must be sized to not create unmitigatable significant impacts. There are no overriding considerations, in my opinion. I strongly object to the provision that states the engineer will issue a statement that informs the building official that certificates of occupancy may be issued despite the fact that Daly City will not allow improvements to be constructed. This is not a mitigation. It is a political presumption in an EIR document. I believe the basis of this is that decision-making power rests somewhere else outside Brisbane. So I believe what is thought that somehow we should have a way to override that, and I disagree with that. I believe if a mitigation measure is required in this mitigation monitoring plan, then that measure shouldn't be set aside because of issues that relate to politics. And I don't think such statements should be in an EIR, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. The same thing is done in this mitigation program over and over. It exists at 4.9-1C and in relation to the city of San Francisco in 4.N-1D, 1E. In 4.N-1F, a review of the improvements, including the length of the rail platform, is needed, and also of the interplay of the rail platform, the Geneva extension, and all the access routes and connections that are required at that place where the Geneva extension crosses over the rail yard, the railway, and another street. Because I believe there's not enough space allotted to achieve all the goals that are required, and that the drawing is not an actual representation of what's there. And I think it would be important if it were reviewed. For mitigation measure 4.N-3A, who pays for all the traffic count monitoring? A funding source needs to be established for all traffic counts in the whole project, and this is an ongoing issue when the project would be, in fact, partially built. Mitigation measure and reporting plan for page 4-84. The mitigation measures should be available when certificates of occupancy are issued. In other words, you can't just say, well, we're going to do it. You have to do it by the time you issue a certificate of occupancy. In the responsibility frequency column on that same page, it's another one of those statements that say that if the city of Daly City or San Francisco refuse to build the mitigation measures, then we're going to issue the certificate of occupancy anyway. I think that should not be done. On mitigation measure and reporting plan, page 4-87, mitigation measure 4.E-3E, there should be specific benchmarks that are met to determine when the requirements of this measure are met. And that is true in every similar traffic mitigation measure. Again, at page 488 and 89, under measure 4.N-3G, again, we have another statement that says that people will have their occupancy certificates issued despite the fact that a mitigation is not built. And if the situation is dire in terms of traffic and circulation, I certainly don't think it's a good idea for this to state this and not even have the mitigation measures that are expected. Page 4-89, measure 4.N-3H. Again, this is about having benchmarks when the requirements of a measure to tell you when the requirements of a measure are met. Page 4-90, measure 4.N-3. Again, another political statement about not having measures that are in here available. The monitoring responsibility for MM4.N-7, the monitoring responsibility for this mitigation is too vague to allow implementation. Page 4-92, measure 4.N-9. This is a decision that should be made by the City Council using advice from the Community Development Director. In this mitigation measure, it says the Community Development Director is going to make a decision that has political implications. On measure 4 page 4-93, measure 4.9-10, this is about sidewalks, and there is not a mention of the requirement that materials and color should not add to the heat sink or the reflection of heat. On page 4-95, measure 4.N-11, why not separate bicycles from cars and pedestrians? Put them on a separate path. That's what's done in England. It's pretty hard to do it here, and it's a place that's built, but where it isn't yet built, one can do it. The responsibility in this section of 4.N-11 is too vague. It doesn't tell you how what it calls for will happen. On page 4-97, measure 4.9-17, the loading areas that are described, and it mentions how they shouldn't interfere with other traffic on other streets. They should also be screened by landscaping from other buildings and from roadways or paths. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Claire.
Good night.
Good night.
And you will send us a copy of your notes.
Yes,
Thank you.
please. Okay, Mr. Berrios?
One of the things that I forgot to mention, Tony Virrios, is on page 19, there's a section that talks about limiting standard construction activities between 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekends and holidays. That's general construction, not pile driving. And I'd like to have the weekend off all the way. We've had a lot of disruption even from just the dirt and concrete operations out there. At one point, when the weather was really good, I think it was last year or the year before, the weather was really good, and we'd come home 10 o'clock at night after a hard day at work, a long, long day at work, and these guys are working out there, pushing bulldozers around, running the backup beepers and making all kinds of noise. We call the Brisbane police. They can't even get in there to deal with them. They weren't prepared to deal with that. And that's not the UPC's fault. That's the contractor's fault. I think those things should be dealt with expeditiously. It mentions it in here, but the question is not what you say you're going to do, but how are you going to make sure it gets done. And the other thing is that it says no pile driving on the weekends, but it got an awful lot of pile driving time during the day, and also mentions drilling before they do the pile driving. I'm not sure because I'm not in that particular line, but I've seen a lot of it done in San Francisco, and that seems to be the standard procedure now, is to drill a hole first and then pop the pile into it because it goes in easier and faster. So that I'm all in support of. Regarding the traffic situation, the first scenario that Mr. Zola mentioned was if we do nothing at all in Brisbane, everybody around us is guaranteed to do lots of things around us. They're doing it right now. and our traffic situation is going to be very negatively impacted regardless of what we think and what we do. I think I got a really good understanding of that part. And seeing as how we don't have, in my impression, the ability to widen Bayshore from Geneva through Brisbane, and we don't have any other roads that we can use to get in and out of here, I don't see us having a whole lot of hope for anything but worsening traffic regardless of what gets built. Unless you take the assumption that Google is going to take over the world and none of us will be able to drive anymore, and we'll all be running around in robot cars that are 3 times more efficient than the way we drive now. Who knows? We may live long enough to see that, but I won't hold my breath on that one. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there's constant comments about all the hazardous mess out on the Baylands. I'll just call it hazardous mess because it's quicker and easier than going into running down the list. But I accept that it's there. And I accept that some of those things are nastier than other things, and I accept the science that tells us that the more you're exposed to it, the worse it is for you or any other living thing that's exposed to it. Although I haven't seen any three-eyed frogs yet, who knows? But I still feel that building all throughout the Bay Area in former rock quarries and former landfills, there's nothing out in the Baylands that presents conditions and circumstances, to my knowledge, that don't exist other places and haven't already been built on in other places successfully. We put a man on the moon. There's incredible technology available and newer things every year. So I'm fairly confident that as long as somebody has deep enough pockets and the desire to disgorge themselves of billions of dollars of non-taxpayer money, they can build, and they can build safely. Our job, it seems to me, is to make sure that they don't have a choice but to build safely, and but to do all of the things that the city commission, city council, and the general public would expect would be practical and realistic, so that we don't find ourselves 20 or 30 years or sometime in the future looking back like San Bruno did when it blew up, because PG&E didn't do those things, because the city fire chief and the city council and the board of supervisors in San Mateo County and nobody made them do those things, and the CPUC didn't make them do the things that they should have been made to do, like tell somebody where the pipe is before they build houses over it, put a street over it. Now we know what's out there now, and we don't have an excuse. So I'm not impressed. I'm not tremendously impressed with UPC's original plan that they put out. But then again, that plan may change dramatically between now and whenever they build. And so I'm not going to judge that there shouldn't be any development based on what I may not like about what the original plan is that I see. I'd like to see development that's well planned, very carefully thought out, and the best possible thing for the city of Brisbane and the surrounding communities, even though we're surrounded by communities that don't seem to be half that concerned about how their developments impact on us. I can guarantee you that, being born and raised in San Francisco, they don't care. They only care about what they want to do for whatever reasons they want to do it. So I understand all of the talk about the hazardous waste, and we can't build there and it will never be safe, and I just think that's completely bull. I just don't think it's based in science, and I'm certain that it can be overcome. At the same time, I'm not an advocate for runaway growth and just build anything and just jam us up with cars so that our only alternative is a bicycle. I hope, I know that you'll be very careful in your consideration. I just think that we should be balanced as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a card? Great.
Good evening, Joel Diaz. So I wanted to talk about HSR, high-speed rail, and I think it's important for the people at home. I think a lot of people don't really understand what is happening with high-speed rail, and I think it's important to clarify it, kind of explain how it's gotten to this point, as I understand it. Do we want high-speed rail in Brisbane? Probably not, It's more like high-speed rail wants Brisbane. And that's kind of the reason why we should analyze it. In the EIR, there are several agencies that also recommend that we analyze high-speed rail, and they call it out in their comments. We have the California State Lands Commission suggested it. The high-speed rail suggested it. San Francisco Office of the Mayor suggested it. San Francisco Public Planning Department suggested it. Also, CREBL, a local organization, suggested it, and now citizens are also suggesting that we include it. And it seems, the question is, why haven't we included it to date? Why hasn't it come up? Why hasn't it really been a material part of the EIR? And when you read the comments in the EIR, the reason given is that HSR is premature and speculative, and therefore unnecessary for us to analyze. But when you talk to high-speed rail, they disagree. In fact, high-speed rail asserts that they just recently spoke with the city staff of Brisbane and said that they strongly disagree with the city's representation that it's premature and speculative, and have countered everything that was asserted in the EIR as to the speculative nature of high-speed rail. And high-speed rail has just recently met with the city to try and clarify that. According to our sources, high-speed rail is going to clarify even further the need to analyze high-speed rail in this EIR. We've heard from Mr. Zola that the reason why it wasn't included was because of Mr. Zola and city staff's guidance and their auspices. And I want to add for the record that it didn't just emanate there, the reason to not include it. And the historical reason that I found was that in 2009, at the city council level, June 22nd, 2009, a special meeting to review and provide direction on Baylands community alternative policy issues, an alternative plan for renewable energy was put forth, including high-speed rail. And at that time in 2009, the city council decided that it wouldn't be a good idea to include it. And the reason given is in the minutes. Hal Topple, the acting city attorney at that time, according to the minutes, City Attorney Topple added that studying the high-speed rail yard in the EIR could create the impression that this would be a desirable use. The city manager also stated that as it sits, the Baylands is very attractive to high-speed rail because it doesn't yet have an EIR approved. He later goes on to say that we can get the EIR approved very quickly. Right immediately after that, two of the council members called to have high-speed rail removed from the renewable energy alternative plan. And so that's when it was decided to not include high-speed rail in 2009. And it was decided ostensibly because we as a city didn't want to encourage high-speed rail, give them the impression that this was a desirable use. So we weren't going to include it. That's why it's not part of the EIR. That's why other agencies have commented that it should be part of the EIR. And the reason why it's so important for us to make it part of the EIR is because it gives the renewable energy alternative a lot more feasibility. The potential for high-speed rail, the potential for the state to purchase the property makes renewable energy viable. That's why we want it in the EIR.
Can you expand on that? Can you expand on that thought? I just don't quite follow it.
So if the state is going to purchase the property and allow us to have renewable energy on their property, it makes renewable energy more viable. In other words, we don't have to buy the property. The state's going to do that. We've had communications with high-speed rail, and they have indicated that, yes, they would allow us to have renewable energy and to be the beneficiary, the financial beneficiary of renewable energy on their property, and which is very encouraging. But we can't explore it further unless high-speed rail the potential for high-speed rail is added to the current renewable energy alternatives. In other words, we need to revise the renewable energy alternative. And furthermore, it really lends itself to the possibility that we could have an even larger renewable energy site out there. This would be on the landfill, on the dump side, on the east side. And high-speed rail put that in their comments in the EIR that they are identifying a 100-acre site on the east side. In speaking with high-speed rail, they said in no way did they suggest that their need is going to be smaller than 100 acres. They just suggested that they are reevaluating what it's actually going to look like. As I understand it, they are going to come forward and clarify their need. They do want it to be analyzed in the EIR. It does help renewable energy. CEQA requires that we give renewable energy a fair chance. That is the law. It's the law that we're required to give renewable energy a fair chance. It's the right thing to do. This is our opportunity to do it. There are a lot of other cities and agencies that want us to do it for obvious reasons. It's a very good thing to do. Legislation is in our favor. There's free money in our favor. High-speed rail is in our favor. So there are ample reasons to include this in the EIR. And so what I would say is that because of that, we do need a major modification to the EIR. It needs to be added. It's a small delay. What does it really mean? It just means a small delay. It's just another revision to one of the alternatives. I'd like to just include this, through the chair, this city council meeting minutes for the record. I'd like it to be part of the record tonight and part of the file. If I could just give it to somebody here.
Did you? You keep saying that high-speed rail. Were you in contact with people this recently, or?
Yes, I personally was. I know that other people are as well, and other people, the city staff especially. The fellow that put the comments in the EIR, his name's Ben. Can't think of how to pronounce his last name, but that's the person I spoke with. He's the one that says he spoke with the city recently and said that these assertions are not accurate. The second thing, I would suggest is reasons why you might deny certification of the EIR. And it specifically has to do with traffic and our ability to predict traffic 25 plus years from now. It seems unreasonable. And our baseline measurement is the year 2010, and we have in the records that the project isn't going to be completed until 2035. Mr. Zola states that, well, there's going to be a phase one, and therefore it doesn't matter, ostensibly. What I say is so what? There's going to be a phase two, too. And did we study the traffic impacts if we break it up into phases? So phase one gets built in 5 or 10 years, but then the infrastructure doesn't get built until phase two. The Geneva overpass doesn't get built until phase two. Has that traffic segregation been analyzed? Is that part of this EIR? And I suspect it's not. But additionally, the fact that the project won't be completed until 2035 seems like an unreasonable amount of time to wait. And it seems like a 2010 standard will not apply in any way. And if the developer's intention is to first start with phase one, as they've mentioned in one of their reports, phase one would be the property along Bayshore Boulevard, the old rail yard. Phase one, where the housing is proposed. That's phase one. Obviously the most lucrative. It's already on Bayshore. It already has infrastructure. In their own report, they're saying, yes, we're going to build the housing first, then we'll look at doing the other infrastructure for phase two, which is the landfill, the commercial retail uses. Then we'll look at building Geneva overpass. And so it seems to me that's not what we're being sold here. You know, we're being sold a complete package, and really that's not what's going to happen. They're going to have phase one, which really benefits the developer, 4,500 homes, and then phase two, which is going to come sometime much later in the future when they come up with the money to build the infrastructure and the Geneva overpass. And that's too much uncertainty. And I think that because it's so far away and we're using 2010 standards on something that's going to take place 25 years from now at least, by the developer's own admission, I think that's reason to deny certification of the EIR. If they want to just propose one project on the old rail yard site, you know, maybe that's different. Maybe they could do that. But if they want to put it in conjunction with everything, a broader program EIR for everything, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think you have reason to deny certification based on our inability to fully understand the traffic impacts of phasing this off, phase one, phase two, and also studying and analyzing traffic impacts based on a 2010 standard when the development won't be completed until 2035. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony Varios, very quickly, I'd just like to say that before Brisbane was incorporated as a city, we had a host of problems and had very little control over them because we were an unincorporated city and we were reliant on the county for things like a sheriff because we had no police department. And it may be that some of our residents have forgotten the good old days weren't all as good as some people think they were. A lot of things have changed in Brisbane for the better. And when Brisbane became a city, it annexed the Crocker Industrial Park. If it weren't for that happening, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. Something else would be. This building was here, but you wouldn't be in it. You'd be up the street on Leland, stuffed in the old, smaller chambers, which were deemed inadequate, otherwise you'd still be there. And we wouldn't have the Sierra Point, because that was part of that growth as well. And without all the money from Sierra Point and Crocker Park in particular, we wouldn't have to worry about John Swickey or Clay Holstein because we couldn't afford them, or the police department, or the fire department. That may be a fair statement, I hope. I hope it is. Anyway, my suggestion is that we shouldn't be afraid of change and we shouldn't be afraid of development. We should just be really incredibly careful about how we do it. And the idea that we can't go forward and we can't certify the CIR because of a bunch of basically what sounds to me like excuses. There are an awful lot of good points that have been brought up, but I think an awful lot of excuses that really don't hold water in terms of looking at the science and what the future holds. So I hope you'll be very, very brave, and I trust your judgment. Thank you.
Mr. Diaz?
I'd like to remind both parties that we're not having a debate tonight. If you have new comments, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Commissioner Anderson.
Joel Diaz, thank you. So I also forgot to mention that, the phase one component is proposing like 4,500 homes, right? And so what if homes aren't approved? And apparently the survey results are back, and as I understand it, it's no on housing. So now what? Here we are rushing to approve this EIR, and they're going to start with phase 1 in housing, but there's not going to be any housing. So it's really the cart before the horse. And I take some umbrage to the fact that these have been called excuses, but I don't think other government agencies are excuses. Other government agencies are requesting adding high-speed rail. They're not making up excuses. They're doing it because it's the law and it's the right thing to do. It's unfortunate. It may be unfortunate. And I can see how people might perceive it as unfortunate to Brisbane. But I think in terms of looking at the opportunity, it's really an amazing opportunity for Brisbane. And we shouldn't look at the cup half empty, but really the cup half full. I mean, not saying this would happen, but just imagine if, Tesla or Elon Musk wanted to come in and partner with the city. Now we have a good partner that wants to help us generate revenue for the city, millions and millions of dollars, to create something of some magnitude that we haven't seen before. Of course, a partner like that would love that location. You can imagine a Tesla sign near the freeway and a giant solar farm. So thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Clarification, please. Okay. So as we agreed in our first public hearing, we didn't really need to make a motion to continue, but it seems that the public would like that clarification. So could I have a motion to continue to our next meeting?
Through the chair, Mr. Zolo, maybe want to, if it's okay, I mean, there are certain issues brought up that if you care to hear from staff
Most definitely. Okay. Did you want us to close the public hearing first?
No, you don't have to close the public hearing.
Okay.
It's continued, but there's just comments for your consideration. So.
I'd like to suggest, if we're still talking about continuing traffic and circulation, I'd like to suggest that we continue it not to the next meeting but to the end, because it's a very complicated section and I think a lot of people have not gotten through it all.
How do the other commissioners feel?
Yeah, and also there was a request to bring Carol Nelson forward, and I think it will make a sense to bring her because she was part of the general plan. So we shouldn't forget that. We should schedule her to bring her viewpoint before us.
Commissioner Parker?
I would like to hear from other people who have had a chance to look at this meeting and maybe, I know, who have been on open streets or whatever, and they may have some more things to say. So yes, I would like to continue. And I certainly wouldn't turn down the opportunity to hear from Carol Nelson.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Yes, I'd like to continue and move it, and also move it to the end. I'd like to stay on track with the topics that we've already set on our calendar.
Okay, so I guess we're looking at right before the public hearing number 7, where the applicant presentation, other organizational presentations are going to happen.
Someone said they can't.
Oh, sorry. So I think we're looking at right before public hearing number 7. Is that correct?
I would just put it on that date.
Or are we looking at after number 7 and before deliberations on November 16th?
Number 7 is the
applicant and the organizational presentations. So that's what I was saying.
We should do before the applicant.
Yeah, that's what I was saying, before or after. That would make sense.
Just replace the one that's the presentation and push everything back one.
So we're suggesting to move public hearing number 7 from November 12th to November 16th to include an extension of the traffic and circulation / noise and vibration discussion.
And also extend the invitation to Carol Nelson.
Right. Yeah, I think we're going to do it one at a time. Yeah. So once we establish the date, we can talk about the presenters.
So you want to set a new public hearing continue this to the 16th of November? Is that your desire?
Actually to the 12th and push the 12th to the 16th.
Oh, okay.
Would that give staff sufficient time to prepare?
There's nothing we need to prepare, so that's.
No. I mean, for the other things that we're pushing back and.
Oh, yeah, we just have to renotice. So the items that were going to be heard on the 12th will move to the 16th.
Okay.
That's your intent?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we can make that work.
So, public hearing number 7 will be traffic and circulation / noise and vibration, part 2. Correct?
Yes.
Agreed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Okay, this will be 16th. So, on to the question of public hearing 7. That will be on the 16th instead of the 12th. In terms of having Carol Nelson come, would that be a part of the organization / presentations?
I would think you'd want her as part of the transportation.
Yeah.
And that
Okay.
was the point.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
that'd be great.
we would have her as part of sort of like a kind of an expert on 11/12
To discuss the
to
general
discuss the
plan.
general plan portion
Yeah.
of her involvement. Okay. So Carol Nelson. And while we're on the subject of applicant presentation, organizational presentations, I think one of the questions was to have, or request was to have public agencies come and present then. Would that be appropriate?
I'm sorry, what was the?
So there was comments and suggestions. It seems as if the discussion of high-speed rail, would that come at November 12th or November 16th?
We've just had the discussion of high-speed rail. What further discussion are you looking?
Well, there was a suggestion, I think, from the audience or the public that other public organizations are suggesting to be more included in the EIR.
So
What would be the staff recommendation to that?
the thought is that every public agency was notified of this hearing schedule, and if they're interested in participating, that they would be in attendance. They're notified of these meetings as well as anybody else.
So they have every opportunity to come and attend
Correct.
any. So perhaps these agencies would like to come on the 12th. Correct, right? So we don't need to schedule any special time. Okay, just want to make that clear. Thank you. So there were several questions. We would love to hear responses.
Yeah, as you prepare now for November 12th, what I would suggest doing is go back to some of the comment letters you heard about today, Daly City's comment letter, San Francisco's series of comment letters, and the High Speed Rail Authority's comment letter. Take a look at those letters and read the actual letters as well as the responses to their comments. And that will lay out the answers to some of the questions like Daly City's. You're going to have an impact in Daly City. You're going to put a mitigation measure here. Who's paying for it? And the answer is the applicant and the person creating it. So that is in the response to Daly City's letter, to the in San Francisco's letters. A couple of things I just want to be very clear about. The EIR does not in any way say high-speed rail is speculative. That is not what the EIR intends to say. What it says is speculative is the design and operation of and specific location and design of a maintenance and storage facility on the Baylands. That, because the 2010 study has been superseded, we have nothing to go by that says it will be this configuration with these operations. So that is, when the term speculative is there, it's simply related to the design location of that rail yard because of the older study being superseded. If at the end of, you had a question?
So you're talking about it was superseded by
the 2012 study.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
Now, if at the end of all of your hearings and your deliberations, you believe that high-speed rail ought to be included in the Baylands, you have the option of saying exactly that. We think whatever alternative, whatever scenario, whatever the general plan permits within the Baylands needs to accommodate high-speed rail.
that could be your recommendation. You have that opportunity to do that. You have the opportunity to allow it to be included without doing an analysis of a plan that's not yet ready to be analyzed, and a plan that needs to be analyzed by law by the agency that's actually proposing it. So we will work with city attorney, if your desire is to include high-speed rail, to find a way of doing it without putting what ought to be the high-speed rail authority's obligation to analyze it on the city of Brisbane. A couple other things I just wanted to be clear on. There is no recommendation in this EIR that you ought to approve residential within the Baylands. There is no recommendation in this EIR that you ought to approve anything here. What the EIR notes, and we'll talk about this when we get to population, is that exactly what we talked about earlier. There's a housing shortage in the greater Bay Area, but when you look at the projections for housing, both in the priority development area, that includes the Baylands, when you look at the housing projections that ABAG has for Brisbane as a whole, and the housing obligation you as a community have under state law, when you adopted your housing element, not that long ago, you have met your obligation for housing within the city of Brisbane through the period that that housing element covers. So the EIR may identify what housing projections are. It may identify issues related to housing in the Bay Area, but you are not obligated, because of that analysis, to approve anything or not approve anything within the Baylands. The other thing that I just wanted to point out is there were questions about bike crossings and bicycle connections over the 101 freeway, connections going north-south, as well as connections to the Bayshore Station. The EIR is based on, and the project proposals, all the scenarios are based on a Geneva extension and improvements to that Candlestick interchange being done. The improvements to Geneva, the Geneva extension, the interchange will provide for bicycle circulation access to the Bayshore Station, as well as getting over the 101 freeway. And while the Bay Trail is commonly thought of as being recreational, every one of the scenarios, every one of the alternatives, except for doing nothing, no project alternative, no build anything, provides for connecting the Bay Trail north and south. So that connection going north of a bicycle trail and going south of a bicycle trail, east and west, is part of every one of the scenarios, every one of the alternatives, except don't build anything. The last thing or a couple other. One is the council direction was to study the CPP and CPP variant. That is the only direction that I believe we have as a consultant, staff has in redoing an EIR, and you in reviewing it, was to study those scenarios at the 8 million or 7 million square feet that's there. You have no obligation, and nobody made any decision that's what needs to be approved or that's what ought to be approved. There is no recommendation on the table right now from staff, from the consultant, from the EIR, from City Council regarding what you ought to recommend to them. That is open to you to do at the end of the hearings. The mitigation measures are enforceable. The EIR addresses build-out of the entirety of the Baylands. In the DSP scenario, all 4,400 dwelling units, all however many million square feet. Phase 1 and 2 only come into play in the air quality section when we're talking about construction impacts on what happens on any given day during construction. The traffic study analyzes building out of the entire Baylands, and the mitigation measures are geared so that those facilities that are needed will be in place
at the time the impact is actually created from the Baylands. And that is that tie of development to there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
For some reason, it's just not going in. Can you just repeat that?
Yeah. The mitigation measure for every one of the intersections that are impacted, say, build these facilities. Whether it's turn lanes, widening, free right turns, signalization, change timing. Every one of the intersections that are impacted has a series of recommendations, and Andy can talk about those specific recommendations if you want to. But they have the specific recommendations, what needs to be done to that intersection.
Depending on what plan we approve?
Depending on which scenario.
It has its own.
Right.
Okay.
Which traffic comes from where. What every one of the mitigation measures say is that the facilities that are needed at that intersection are to be in place, they're to be paid for, operational, and functional before any development is in a building creating the impact and Baylands traffic is sent to that intersection. So
that includes Geneva also, right?
Including the Geneva extension and the interchange improvements at the Candlestick intersection.
So if Geneva is not certain yet, then what's going to happen?
Right, which means that if that uncertain facility is not built, the applicant, you cannot as a city approve development based on site-specific development that's not going to have the facilities it needs. This is the reason you do a program EIR, so that when a project comes forward, even before it's submitted, a developer of a site-specific project will know what facilities need to be there. And we're trying to be very clear up front what facilities may be needed 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, whenever those developments come forward to you. They are enforceable, they are requirements, and the only place that there is any option on the part of the city is where facility improvements need to be built in Daly City, because that's where the intersection is. What do you do if Daly City says, which is hard to imagine given all the traffic they're busy creating and all the traffic San Francisco's busy creating, it's hard to imagine them saying, no, we don't want a developer out of Brisbane helping us add to this intersection. But in the event that they would actually say something like that we don't want you improving anything here, we're not going to accept improvements, we're going to let the existing stay no matter who's building what, then under CEQA, you have a situation where that mitigation measure that was proposed cannot be built, and the overriding consideration, or I should say the unavoidable impact, is Daly City may for some reason say no. San Francisco for some reason may say no. You have discretion on your part when you look at approving any project, whatever it may be, what significant unavoidable impacts you accept, what you don't accept, whether you want to reduce the build out of the development to one of the reduced intensity alternatives, reduce it even further beyond those alternatives to recommend leaving the general plan, the existing general plan EIR cap on the Baylands, or the cap, development cap that is set in the renewable energy alternative. Those are choices you get to make when you're making your recommendations. The last thing would be for when you read the mitigation measures, when you read the EIR letters and the responses, take a look at the responses, because some of the comments from San Francisco, the mitigation measures too open-ended, were in fact revised in the final EIR in response to San Francisco's comments. So read both their comment letter and the responses. And with that, I think I've said all I have. And you had something before we go?
Just one quick comment on this idea of, mitigation measures are the responsibility of another agency. And, if the commission didn't feel comfortable at saying, well, there should be some wiggle room or flexibility in implementing that, the net effect of that potentially is that you allow another city to end up controlling the development. If you're saying you shall do this in Daly City, and Daly City does not allow for that mitigation measure to be implemented, essentially they are now controlling the city's ability to allow for its own development. So again, that's more of a policy question as you kind of go down the road and you think of these mitigation measures and the validity of overriding findings and providing some wiggle room and something of that effect, and just something to think about.
Okay. So what I see is some of the mitigation measures are actually public utilities, such as moving Bay Shore. So we're not discussing that, which is outside agencies deciding where they're going to put something, or whether they're going to electrify Caltrain or...
Correct. Yeah.
Right. I mean, what we're talking about is where signs are going to go up, where intersections are going to be put in. That's correct?
Yes, and you are not deciding where Caltrain puts their station. You are not.
So that wouldn't be part of the mitigation?
No.
Okay.
No, mitigation measures would talk about making sure there is access to the station, making sure there are bicycle lanes leading to the station, but not, we require the station to be here. You don't get to make that requirement.
So, but then some of the mitigation sounded like what we needed to do was to have more busing from one location to another. That's not the mitigation you're talking about?
Yeah. In those cases, there are mitigation measures referring to shuttles from development within the Baylands to the Caltrain station to the Balboa Park station. You do have the ability as a mitigation measure to require the development to provide and maintain shuttles to transit stations. You do not have, you have the ability to require a developer to provide funds for capital improvements, buying buses, adding trains. So you could require providing that kind of mitigation. You don't have the ability to tell, as an example, Caltrain, you will buy more trains, you will change your schedule. You don't have the ability to tell Muni, you will buy more cars, you will change your schedule to accommodate more, but you certainly can require the developer and the project and development within your city to provide mitigation for those impacts to the agency. What you cannot control is what the agency, outside agency, does with any funds given to them. And under any circumstances, the land use decisions within the Baylands rest with the City of Brisbane.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Under any circumstances, the land use decisions for property within the Baylands rest with the City of Brisbane.
Oh, of course.
So I have some questions, if everyone's okay with that. Could you clarify the CNEL and versus the DBA distinction and basically the technicalities as to why?
Okay. I'll do something dramatic. Yep. Single event noise level. That was a single event. That I'm talking now at about unamplified about 65 decibels. That's a normal speaking voice. A single event noise level is when a plane goes overhead, you hear that noise. Noise is measured in decibels. That's simply a measurement of noise. But the difference between the measurement of that single event, a plane going overhead, the bang, or any noise event, that's measured in decibels. Community noise equivalent level is a way of averaging noise over a 24-hour day. So you take all the individual noise events, traffic on the freeway, traffic on Bayshore, Caltrain, airplanes flying overhead, put all of that together, and there are complex formulas as to how that is averaged over a day, and you get what is a CNEL, community noise equivalent level, which itself is measured in decibels. So when we say 65 CNEL contour, it is also correct to say a CNEL is 65 decibels. But CNEL is an average over time, whereas decibels by themselves tend to be associated with single events.
So it's duly noted that we're going to be considering how this affects all of Brisbane. That would include noise in the ridge. So I just wanted to address that. Could the staff do me a favor and pull the report up online and kind of go through the steps? I think that folks in the audience can, and also viewers can use that direction.
For what?
The staff report? Because there was some feedback that was not accessible.
Sure. All our reports are, on the web page, and maybe Julia can just.
I'm waiting for our projector to
come up.
Sorry.
There's a page with the Planning Commission homepage, and all the agendas. This agenda was probably posted Friday with the staff report. There was another email blast sent today as a reminder that also linked it to that, but it has been available since Friday online. So, Julia, you can just kind of.
Sorry for the.
Go ahead and use your microphone.
So, from the city's website, brisbaneca.org, as John said, for any meeting, you would go to the City Government tab, which drops down, and click on All Meetings. And from there, you would select tonight's meeting. And so a page shows you the entire agenda, and these hyperlinks here have the staff report right here. We also, just as a point of information, we have been pulling the relevant chapters that are being discussed, and also posting links to PDFs on the online agenda so people can look at them there. And we will be also posting the presentations. So, hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's very helpful. It's akin to what Commissioner Anderson was doing with our hyperlinks in his demo. I think it's really helpful to make it clear as to how to access these documents because they are so important. Also, could Lloyd address the question or the comments about occupancy permits? And is it really a toolbox? Is it really a tool in our toolbox?
Yes, it is, but.
Yes, and obviously when you start looking at the implementation of mitigation measures and the ones related to traffic, as you aren't going to wait till the occupancy permit to first look at, is anybody even contemplating building the facility? So if we know, and I'll use the largest of them as an example, the Geneva extension, the mitigation measure says that any site-specific development that would cause impacts at, well, we use the interchange, at the Candlestick interchange to not meet standards, you would not issue the occupancy permit until till the interchange would be in place. Obviously, at the time you're looking at a site-specific development, if that development were going to cause level of service at the existing interchange up at, as you get off Candlestick interchange, cause that to be service standards to be exceeded, and if at that point the Geneva extension, the whole bi-county program, were no farther than it is today, you'd say, no way in the world is this project going to be able to meet that mitigation standard. So there's also some logic that you'll need to use as you're looking at your individual site-specific developments and how far along are some of these improvements. Some, like Geneva extension, the freeway interchange, take long lead time. So when you had site-specific developments in front of you, you would have an expectation that they are well along in design or construction, as opposed to a site-specific development project that's had simply adding turn lanes, putting in a traffic signal where the time frame is much shorter. The idea is that you have control at the point, one, that you approve a site-specific development to know specifically what has to be there, and can it in fact be provided at the time occupancy permits would be in place, and the city does not need to issue those occupancy permits if an applicant has not done what he was supposed to do. An applicant who has not done what they were supposed to do doesn't deserve to have the buildings occupied. And I've had clients on my private sector projects where they have had to deal with the timing of finishing infrastructure. Sometimes the buildings get done first, and they know when that kind of requirement is there, they don't get to start leasing the buildings till their infrastructure is in place. It's a very standard thing. The other thing in terms of phasing, we'll talk about this in land use. The phasing program that's now in the specific plan needs a lot more to it. So it is missing some pieces in terms of its phasing. We'll talk about that in the land use analysis and general plan consistency.
I think the question, yes, go ahead. I think the question was how much hammer we will have when it's dependent on the other city, because the occupancy certificate is issued by the city of Brisbane, but now the project is held on because of the
I was answering within Brisbane, sorry. For an improvement outside of the city of Brisbane, so an improvement to a Daly City intersection, a San Francisco intersection. My suggestion would be, and we can discuss this, modifying it to the mitigation monitoring program, that when you have a site-specific development in front of you, if it requires an improvement within San Francisco or Daly City, you ought to know that what those two cities, either one of those cities, are going to say. But right now, we're talking, will Daly City accept an improvement that hasn't been designed yet? Will San Francisco accept something that hasn't been designed yet? We can't tell you whether they'll approve it or not. They can't tell you whether they'll approve it or not, because even if they tell you now, no, we will never approve that, they could change their mind by the time it occurs. Even if they say, absolutely, we'll approve it, they could change their mind later. And as John said, one of the difficult points you will face is if you decide what it is appropriate to approve. And remember, as we saw, there are certain intersections that under even the least intensive development of the Baylands are going to create impacts in other cities. Do you want to give Daly City the ability to say, or San Francisco the ability to say, gee, I know you approve something, I know you think that's in your best interest, but I'm not going to let you build that improvement in mine, so too bad what you approved. That is a very difficult thing for one city to say to another city, and one of the things I heard earlier is we have politics in the mitigation measures. The politics are what do they decide or not decide, and what we've laid out is what is necessary to mitigate the impact wherever the city boundaries are, and what legal rights do those other cities have. If you want to, city attorney is here also, or special counsel if you want to hear more about the legalities of how that works.
Okay.
It would be great if you could expound on that.
Allison Crumbine, outside legal counsel. Well, as Lloyd said, and I think to be clear, CEQA goes beyond the geographic boundaries of individual municipalities. So when you're analyzing the impacts of a project, those impacts could reach, beyond Brisbane. And so under CEQA, we're required to analyze impacts that go beyond Brisbane. But as Lloyd has stated, we can't impose mitigation measures that go outside of Brisbane. So ultimately, when mitigation measures would rely on approvals of other agencies, the EIR has concluded that those impacts would remain significant and unavoidable because we can't guarantee that the measures would be imposed. And so ultimately, at such time as the City Council considers whether to approve a project, if there are significant unavoidable impacts because mitigation measures have been identified that cannot legally be imposed by the city, it's up to the council to decide whether it believes that the value of the project outweighs those significant unavoidable impacts, and it would do so by approving a statement of overriding considerations and essentially finding that the project has value, that the city wants to approve the project, and that it's willing to accept those significant unavoidable impacts. So that's essentially how that process works, if that is clear.
A few more questions here. I think there was a comment made about the structure of public hearings and the applicant's participation, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Like everyone else, the applicant is allowed to come to the public hearings, just as the public is or any other organizations that's interested. Is that correct?
That is correct. Under the Brown Act, meetings are required to be open to the public, and members of the public have the right to participate in public hearings. These hearings are a little different than the standard public hearing. You know, a lot of times, as I think people have pointed out, there'll be one night where a project will be heard, and often a city or county or a public agency will give an applicant some period of time to present at the outset, and then members of the public will have an opportunity to comment. And sometimes, you know, cities will divide it into supporters of the project, opponents of the project. But here, since there's so many nights, and obviously there's been one night identified for the applicant to present as well as community groups to present, but there are a lot of other public hearings, and it's certainly the case that the applicant has the same rights as any other member of the public to appear and present within the time limits set by the Commission.
And as a reminder, for our public hearing where the applicant and or other organizations are presenting, there is also an additional section for public comment. So the public is also welcome to be there. Let's see. A couple questions were addressed to the applicant, and I see he's no longer here, so perhaps he can address them at the next meeting or during his presentation. In terms of the HSR, and the comment about the reasoning being incomplete, the minutes have been given to the staff, so I guess we will have it to read and ponder.
I'm fully aware of that. I'm fully aware of the minutes. Okay. So, okay. Yes, it's true. That was part of the consideration. Certainly, the council directs this process. They direct what got studied in the EIR. What Lloyd pointed out is also quite accurate in terms of lack of meeting the objectives, the lack of clarity as to what is a quote-unquote project that we were allegedly supposed to study in terms of the acreage, location, et cetera, et cetera. None of those factors were available even in 2010, even with that schematic study. I would argue that did not constitute a project you would have been able to evaluate in an EIR. And certainly with the later discussions, and there's nothing that's provided any more clarity. In fact, there's less clarity as to their wishes or desires when it comes to the Baylands property, high-speed rail. So, yeah, I'm fully aware of that.
And we can pull that online.
It's right here.
Right, yeah. Okay. Just to be clear. And in terms of the survey results, could you give us an update on, that was commented on as well?
I was going to do that in staff items.
Oh, sure.
I can do it now.
Okay.
The council, on their meeting this, in 2 nights, Thursday night, they will be considering setting a special hearing for October 26th for the survey consultant to give a presentation to the council. And so certainly the Planning Commission would be encouraged to either attend live or view it in
That's going to be
person.
what day?
The 26th. The council would have to set that. they're going to be considering setting a hearing for the 26th
Of October?
of October 26th, yes. And
So we will not have the access to the survey until after that council meeting?
I don't know that for a fact. The council will be discussing this Thursday night, so if they want to do something different, this was a proposal being made that they...
But the thing is, Planning Commission should have the access to the survey because it's part of the...
You definitely will,
Yeah.
yes. It's just a
But
matter of when...
We should have it before the consultant or whosoever is going to present that. So if we go to the meeting, we go prepare, understanding what the survey results were.
I can relay that. I'll relay that
You should provide us before the meeting.
I can relay that request to the city manager, and he'll be at the council meeting Thursday night, and he can relay that to the council.
Thanks.
Sure.
Is it possible to give us a summary of what the survey results showed so far? Just a summary?
I don't have the results off the top of my head.
Okay. So. Well, that was it in terms of questions that I noted. Did anyone else have any other questions?
No.
No, at the time.
No? Oh, okay. So do you want to make a motion to continue this to the public hearing number 4, October 22nd?
For what?
Sure, Mr. Diaz.
Joel Diaz, thank you, Chair. So yeah, I really do appreciate the chance to rebut some of this because it is powerful testimony when it comes from staff and from these experts, and it kind of, diminishes what was said and what preceded it oftentimes. And so it's good, and thank you for allowing the public to rebut some of this. And I just want to get it clear and on the record and make sure we all understand that it seems that, to me, that what Mr. Zola said was that, yes, in fact, this EIR contemplates phasing. There's phase 1 and there's phase 2. And in this report here, 9.4.3, infrastructure phasing, it states that phase 1 is going to be, because existing infrastructure is located primarily along Bayshore Boulevard, most of the development in the first phase, which is estimated to end in 2020, will occur on the rail yard portion of the planning area. The second major phase of development will be triggered by the extension of Geneva Avenue and reconfiguration of the Candlestick Point interchange, and to a lesser extent, the completion of the first phase of the Bayshore Intermodal Station. So the planning area is anticipated to be built out by 2035. So we are using 2010 traffic standards to evaluate a project that we know is going to be built in 2035. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But also, I think people really need to understand that, yes, we are talking about approving an EIR that is going to that contemplates 2 phases. Phase 1 and then phase 2 whenever, but probably by 2035. I also heard that, the chair asked what the recommendation of staff was as far as involving HSR further in this process. And the response I heard was, well, they were notified by the EIR and they had a chance to respond, and so that's kind of good enough. And I think we all know that probably isn't good enough. I think the citizens of Brisbane deserve a higher standard of care when there's this much controversy circling around. Can we contact HSR? Sure. You are the Planning Commission. Could you ask staff to do so and have something in writing? Could HSR come and make a presentation? Of course they could. Is there a location in the EIR? Yes, there is a location. It's the east side of the train tracks. Does HSR have plans? Yes, they do have plans. It's a very simple concept. 100 acres, there's a few tracks. That's what happens. It's pretty basic. We just need to know the boundaries. We don't need to know the actual, necessarily, a lot of specificity about their buildings and other site facilities, but basically the shape, the size. They have that information. But if we don't ask, we're not going to get it. So I would ask that you do contact them and do a little bit more due diligence and don't just say, oh, well, we notified them. They had a chance to respond. We have the City Council meeting minutes directing what happened with high-speed rail. It's a very big coincidence that somehow there's not enough detail to analyze it. So I think this is obviously political, and I think the citizens deserve a higher standard of care. And politicians make mistakes all the time. We know that. It's proverbial. And it's your guys' charge to make sure that we do this right. Thank you.
I do want to know what we are doing in terms of for the public hearing number now 8. Are we extending any special invitations to any organization? Or are they all duly notified?
Actually, we're going to have to do some outreach because we haven't talked to all the. I have an expectation of some community groups that I believe will want to make a presentation, but we haven't formally made that scheduling yet. Yeah, but it's something that's ongoing.
Could we add HSR to that list?
So you want HSR to come and give a presentation on
their plans and their, I mean, it seems like we should at least have a letter from them. Last time we heard from them was 2012, or when was the last time we heard from them?
The comment date on that. Well, if that's, again, the commission, if you want to vote and direct staff to contact them to do something, yes, we'll
I think we should.
That's your direction.
I think to clear the air, we should find out what their plans are, so that we know for sure what's going to happen. You know, in my understanding, that you don't have to have a complete design, as long as you have the intent that there's going to be a rail yard and that they describe the boundary, then it should be included as a part of the alternate.
Yeah, if I were going to analyze a rail yard, and I have done analysis of a UP rail yard and a couple others, I want to know the size, I want to know the daily operations in terms of how many trains get moved, how often, how many cars are there, and just, you know, the movement and the operation. So it's a little bit more than just size and configuration. I think also if it's on the east side of the rail, 100 acres, I'll also want to ask, and what does it look like getting from the grade of where the Caltrain line is now up on top of the landfill? So I'd want a little bit of preliminary engineering to know how the landfill itself is treated to get the rail up on top. And it's really the operations issues. And the letter that you had asked about, the comment letter from the High Speed Rail Authority is dated September 2013. That was during the public review period for the draft EIR. And so you'll see that is, at this point, their official response to what is in the draft EIR. The comment letter received during the comment period.
Yeah, and I believe that comment letter said it referred to an earlier comment letter from 2012 that I didn't see in there.
Right. Yeah. That was a response to the NOP, which is also on the city's website. That's what the 2011, or the reference to the previous letter was. Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Miller?
Annie Miller, I'd like to add a personal anecdote here. My husband and I were the only Brisbane people attending a high-speed rail public forum in Burlingame last week, and we heard a very, very good interaction between people. There must have been 200, 300 people there, and what I got out of that meeting was a tremendous encouragement for communities to be in touch. HSR wants bottoms-up approach. So what the city wants, they will respond to. What the people want, they will respond to. Whether they, again, technical questions or something else, I fully acknowledge all that. But if the city shows interest in working with them to come up to something that we need to know more about, I think they will respond. And there were so many, for instance, there was a question there in all those communities that are really having trouble considering that 20 trains per hour that will be traveling through all those neighborhoods that are right next to the rail line. Caltrain and high-speed rail will result in 20 trains per hour, and they have all those grade crossings. That was the big problem. Burlingame, they have tremendous grade crossings. Now, how are they going to travel across if they don't have overcrossings? And the answer was very interesting that San Mateo, who has been bottoms up and working with the high-speed rail, already has 2 overcrossings on the way because they came up with that idea and they talked about it. They cooperated early on. And it's the bottoms up that they really have a new attitude. It used to be very bad the other way, top down. And they have changed their philosophy. It's bottoms up, and it's up to us to tell them what we need. And I think they will respond within the limits, of course, that they can. But that's what I want you to know, that there is a real willingness. And they definitely, I personally have heard that they would like to be in Brisbane. Of course, you know, the procedure is what it is. And you have to deal with speculation in that sense. But I do think that they would work with us if we ask for it.
And also, I think they mentioned that they're going to run on the Caltrain tracks, right? I mean, jointly.
Yes, it's going to be a hybrid system. Right. It's going to be Caltrain and the high-speed rail together.
So we already know the tracks. We already know the number of tracks.
And we already have extra tracks, actually, here in Brisbane. They were constructed several years ago.
So the missing information is already there.
I would disagree that what you're indicating, which is all in the electrification EIR about the blended system, has any merit on or any bearing on the design of a rail yard. There's no information.
No, I'm familiar with the design of the rail yard. I've done that, so I know very, very well. The question was a number of trips, and they already indicated there's going to be 20 trains per hour. Also, the question was where it's going to be, and they already mentioned it's going to be on the jointly on Caltrain's tracks. So tracks are already there. So now, and you know the boundary they're talking about 100 acres. So what more you need to study that?
The simple answer is yes. We know the operations on the line.
You didn't know before until the last meeting.
No, we know the operations on the line are laid out 100 acres, but what they are now studying is the actual operation of a maintenance yard. How many cars will be stored, how they'll be moved, and that's the part that would be necessary to analyze that part.
That's not a big issue. my
I'd like to hear from them.
Yeah.
I would.
Okay, so just a matter of procedure. We are now at 11:06, and technically we should be ending at 10:30. We need a motion to extend it.
I think there are no other issues to be discussed, are there?
We haven't had.
You can go ahead and close the.
We haven't had.
Well, no, we still need to have a motion to extend it before we continue. So could I have a motion?
I make a motion to extend until.
I'll second that.
11:15.
11:15.
And 30 seconds.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. So could we continue that conversation? We were. Sorry, for procedural purposes, I had to interrupt.
There's no.
Did you have any?
No, I think we'll discuss in the detail when we are at the deliberation point. By that time, we probably have more information from HSR. So I don't think there is need to discuss any further at this point. We will reserve that until that time. By that time, we will have more information also.
And also, I think we can continue it to public hearing number 7, since we're having part 2 happening. By then, would you be able to gather enough additional information, facts for us to think about?
Okay.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Do we have anything else that we want to ask in terms of this issue? Anyone else?
There's none.
So now can we make a motion to actually continue this to public hearing number 4?
I motion to continue this to public meeting number 4.
And what's the date then?
October 22nd at 7:30 p.m.
And can we have a second?
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So thank you very much for bearing with us and staying with us and listening and sharing. We now have to move to the consent calendar.
We're not finished.
For the record, the consent calendar, there is nothing noted for the consent calendar, so it will be adopted as is. We're moving on to oral communications. Would anyone in the audience like to address the commission on any issue that is not on the calendar or agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to written communications. And written communications, I would like to acknowledge two pieces. One from Clara Johnson with her public comments from public hearing number 2. Thank you very much. And also a reminder that there is a Parkside plan. There's a pop-up event on Saturday, October 24th from 10 to 12:30. I think this has been widely distributed, but we just want to make a note of that for you. And then on to items initiated by the staff, but I think we addressed that, correct? Okay. Items initiated by the commission?
Nothing.
No.
No? Okay. We just may make your 11:15 mark. So now it's 11:09. Would we like to make any motion to adjourn to a regular meeting of October 22nd, 2015 at 7:30?
No.
No, that was a continuation for the public hearing.
Yeah, okay.
So now we make a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn until October 22nd.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Good night.